This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 36 of the Naked Mormonism podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, July 14th, 2016. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. After much ado, today's episode is the next historical timeline episode in our progression through studying Mormon history. But before jumping into the meat of today's episode, let's wet our palate with the milk of the last historical timeline episode. On episode 35, we covered a lot of time and topics. We began with a discussion about the Hebrew school taught by Joshua Sextus that Joe set up in one of the upper rooms of the temple, a room which would later be dedicated to being a translating room, which I really can't figure out why the fuck Joe needed an entire room just to read stuff from one language into another one. I assume that any room with a table in it, he could still do it. But anyway, he was a prophet. He could do whatever he wanted, so I guess I shouldn't nitpick there. But after that, we talked about a little altercation between Joe and his younger brother, William Smith. Oftentimes, we see the Smith family painted in, a picture of this harmonious and simple-minded agrarian family without any real conflict. But that might have been true between Joe and Hiram or Joe and Alvin before Alvin died. But when it came to Joe's little brothers, there seemed to be a little bit of sibling rivalry there, as one would expect in any typically large family. Apparently, this fight between Joe and William was enough to call William in under ecclesiastical punishment to be disfellowshipped from the church for assaulting the prophet. But instead of an actual excommunication or disfellowshipping, Joe's uncle and his father and his older brother and a couple of the members of the Quorum of the 12 called in Joe and William to kind of an intervention gathering, and apparently apologies were made and differences were reconciled between the two. Joe even recorded in the history of the church, I apologized where I had been out of the way, which was quite an admission on Joe's part because he never said anything like that before, especially because he was the one who lost the physical fight, from what I can tell. William, his younger brother, must have really done a number on Joe because it was actually rumored that Joe felt the effects of this fight until the day he died 8 years after it happened. This is a serious beating if you want to try and quantify a fight between two guys. But after William and Joe reconciled, we discussed Joe's stance on slavery and abolitionism. Up to this point, I kind of always respected Joe to a certain extent because he'd left the question of slavery as a states' rights kind of issue, basically saying the North shouldn't be able to tell the South what to do and vice versa. However, in this little screed that we read, which was published in the Messenger and Advocate as the front page article, Joe established the South's biblical defense of slavery and said that they were justified and righteous in holding slaves based solely on biblical principles. It's fucking disgusting. He even said that if slavery is evil, then wouldn't the Southern slaveholder be the first to know about it? That's a bullshit question because the defense for American slavery was wholly taken from the Bible. And beyond that, Joe had no problem overriding biblical teachings and inserting his own ideas and morality as God's will. He did it all the time. He could have just come up with a revelation and declared right then and there that God doesn't like slavery, taking the moral stance. But he didn't, and we see why Joe took the PR-friendly stance on slavery. Joe was afraid of taking the abolitionist side and pissing off all the Southern members of the church, and possibly making persecution in Missouri, of course, the northernmost slave state, even worse than it already was. However, if Joe sided with the South and declared that it's righteous for people to own other people as slaves, the abolitionists have it all wrong, if he decided that the majority of his followers, which were people from the northern states, would disagree with him, and they'd probably leave the church and find another church to pay their tithes to. Joe couldn't let that happen. All of that being said, I see why Joe said what he did, and, he kind of took the non-partisan perspective on slavery, but I still lost a bit of respect for him in doing so. I mean, if he were a genuine prophet of God, God had a great opportunity to declare slavery immoral forever. I mean, and this was only 30-something years before the Civil War happened. Couldn't God see the writing on the wall? But if we look at the flip side of that, if Joe was acting on his own accord, which I think is much more reasonable, of course, he had a chance to make a declaration of morality that he knew to be right, but instead opted for the PR-friendly version and just shot straight down the middle and said that we should just leave each other to do what each other will do. I mean, it's total PR bullshit, and I just can't wait until today's church gets a little bit closer to the middle with LGBT rights, as opposed to their current stance of crying foul on their religious freedom to allow them to be bigots. But, maybe I'm crazy in drawing a parallel between that here. So later in that episode 35, after covering Joe's perspective on slavery, we talked about possibly the greatest thing in all of Mormon history up to this point. Now, it wasn't the Fanny Alger affair, which was amazing, nor was it Joe buying mummies and papyri for a shitload of money that the church didn't have. I mean, it wasn't even anything relating to, the smear campaign of Dr. Philastus Hurlbut or some kind of, legal trouble that Joe stepped into. The greatest thing in Mormon history up to this point is truly more ironic than fiction could imagine. I mean, sometimes truth is really stranger than fiction, and that's a phenomenon that was played out from July to October of 1836, which finished up the historical portion of the last historical timeline episode. This beautifully serendipitous moment in Mormon history can only be summed up as the most dramatically ironic thing in all of human history, let alone Mormon history. I mean, until the Book of Mormon came out, Joe made his living by promising people he could find buried treasure in obscure places. Well, in July of 1836, a man named Burgess approached the presidency and promised them he knew where to find buried treasure in Salem, Massachusetts. Joe and company took the bait and left immediately for Salem, only to find that Burgess didn't know which house the treasure was buried near. So Burgess basically just walked off, and the leadership stayed in Salem, renting a house for over 2 months in order to keep searching for that damn buried treasure. It's beautiful. It's great. I mean, the greatest swindler that we know in religious history got hoodwinked, all while insurrection was building in the ranks back in Kirtland, Ohio. It's beautiful. All right, that does it for the roundup of our historical timeline from episode 35, so let's jump right into the meat of today's episode. To give you a quick rundown and overview of what we'll be talking about today, we're going to discuss dissent in the church and Bloody Brigham coming to Joe's rescue. We'll lightly touch on John Cook Bennet, who was one crazy motherfucker in just my cursory reading about this guy. There's a dispute about the nature of God between Rigdon and Ollie, and we can see who Joe sided with from a later quote. And then to close out the episode, we'll jump into the huge topic of the Kirtland Bank. And I actually bring on a guest to help parse out the confusing language in the articles of the agreement for the bank. So let's jump right into it. And, to assess the situation here, at this point, Joe, Ollie, Rigdon, and Hiram were all in Salem, Massachusetts, kind of headed on their way back to Kirtland. They'd spent a fair amount of time there, which may have created some issues that we'll talk about in a minute. They left the Quorum of the 12 in the command seat while they were gone at a time when dissent was rife throughout the church. To be clear, dissent was always going on since the very beginning of the church, but there were a few factors that had amped up the level of dissent by this point. The Missouri Mormons were being led completely by proxy because persecution had caused Joe to basically fear going to Missouri. He made as few trips out to Missouri as humanly possible while still being called their leader. He was afraid of getting chased off with pitchforks like he was back in the good old days from Colesville. Joe was basically running everything in Missouri through his liaisons, which were William Wines Phelps, or Double Dub Phelps, and then John Whitmer, who we know as John Goebbels Whitmer. The Missouri Mormons had been kicked completely out of Independence, Jackson County, Missouri. And as far as I can tell, there weren't any practicing Mormons left in Independence. They had all fled to the counties north of Jackson County, namely Clay County and the soon-to-be designated Caldwell County. In August of 1836, Double Dub Phelps and John Goebbels Whitmer began settling the little town of Far West in Daviess County, which would later be changed to Caldwell County very soon after 1836. Amazingly enough, Far West is a place in Mormon history that is very paramount to the story of Mormonism, and it's going to be very quickly become a theater of operation where a lot of important things go on. And surprisingly enough, the plat that Joe drew out for Independence of the 24 temples that we discussed back in episode 34, that plat was used to plan out Far West with a 1 square mile plot. After multiple buildings were erected and, more Mormons started moving to Far West, the plot was expanded to a 4 square mile plot, and it was declared an actual township of Far West, Missouri. Double Dub and John Goebbels Whitmer were responsible for a lot of the church's success in Missouri. We can't go without mentioning that. They were very, very important in Missouri. Beyond this, tumultuous time in Missouri, the Saints had finished the temple in Kirtland, dragging the church into, anywhere from $40,000 to $50,000 in debt. The temple itself costed anywhere from, $30,000 to $35,000. So, needless to say, there was a bit of debt that the church held. And, the dedication ceremony of the Kirtland Temple, we talked about this recently, it was nothing more than a drunken hallucinogen party. If you look at it, from my mind, if you look at it through the naked Mormonism glasses here, most of the Mormons that were living on property purchased by the church were essentially squatting because the church was defaulting on every one of its debts, on all the loans. To the point that Joe and friends had gone to Salem to go treasure hunting to hopefully pay back some of the debt. It's ridiculous. But in addition to these internal problems, there were many pastors and preachers that were making quite a healthy living going on anti-Mormon preaching circuits. We'll read some newspaper articles later that really play this out and we can see what they were saying. But there were smear campaigns everywhere trying to expose Joe and the church for the fraud that it was. It had become fairly public knowledge by this point that, Joe and Fanny were having an affair, which was actually a really big problem for a lot of people. And, it started rumors of polygamy in Kirtland. How could the one true prophet of God be having an affair with, this young servant girl that was living in his house that wasn't even 20 years old? The people didn't have guaranteed proof of the affair, but there were rumors circulating, and they did know that Emma loved Fanny, and Fanny was one of her favorite people, and they were great friends. But then, for some reason, Emma's mood changed to the polar opposite of being disgusted and, hating Fanny, basically. And then Emma kicked her out of the house, forcing her to move to Indiana with her family. Any suspicions that people had of Joe and Fanny getting busy together were basically confirmed by Fanny's expedited flight from Missouri after those allegations rose. So to add to all of these pressures that were causing people to question Joe's authority claim as the one true prophet, Joe had this papyri, but still hadn't delivered the translation of it as promised. People were excited to see what Abraham and Joseph of Egypt had written on the papyri, as Joe had claimed anyway. And the fact that Joe wouldn't produce what was promised sat wrong with a lot of people. And needless to say, the church was, as usual, balancing on a knife edge. Anybody could come along and give it one little push and take the church in a whole new direction. Well, there's evidence to suggest that somebody was trying to influence the church during Joe, Ollie, Hiram, and Rigdon's absence when they were in Salem. This is taken from the autobiography history of Wilford Woodruff, the same Wilford Woodruff that would become the fourth prophet of the church in Salt Lake City. Now, I pulled this from the BOAP.org website, which is a website called the Book of Abraham Project, and it's run by BYU, hosted on BYU servers. And it's a frequent source that I use for these first-hand accounts. It's great. It's a huge library of autobiographies. And, of course, there will be a link to Wilford Woodruff's autobiography in the show notes if you want to read the rest of it. It's a really fascinating autobiography. Quote, I attended meeting at the temple. President Joseph Smith Jr. had been absent on business for the church, but not half as long as Moses was in the mount away from Israel. Yet many of the people in Kirtland, if they did not make a calf to worship, as did the Israelites, and there's in brackets here apostasy, that's what it's describing, I don't know who added that in, turned their hearts away from the Lord and from his servant Joseph, and had engaged in speculation and given way to false spirits until they were darkened in their minds. And many were opposed to Joseph Smith, and some wished to appoint David Whitmer, D-Day David Whitmer, to lead the church in his stead. In the midst of this cloud of dark spirits, Joseph returned to Kirtland, and this morning arose in the stand. He appeared much depressed, but soon the Spirit of God rested upon him, and he addressed the assembly in great plainness for about 3 hours, and put his enemies to silence. Now, I'm going to read what he said in just a minute here, but first I have to discuss how Joseph got back to Kirtland. But it's an amazing sermon. I'm going to read it in a minute here, but it's really amazing. But basically, Joe claimed that he was made the prophet of the church by the power of God, and anybody that tries to take that away from him, they're going to go to hell, basically. I mean, there's some powerful words from the humble and pious prophet of God, but this is kind of a recurring theme that we've seen many times before now and will continue to see even more frequently after this point. Anytime Joe felt threatened, he would come up with some sermon, just like this one, to tell everybody that he was the one true prophet of God, and anybody that says otherwise is led by the devil to do so. But this sermon is unique. Of all the people to lead the opposition to Joe, you might not necessarily expect D-Day David Whitmer to be one of them. Of course, we know that the first dissent was in 1830, and that was kind of led by Ollie, and it was basically Ollie had convinced the entire Whitmer family that Joe was a fraud. And of course, Joe kind of jumped on damage control as soon as he possibly could return to Fayette, New York. So maybe it isn't all that surprising that D-Day David was the guy fingered as the possible usurper of the throne during Joe's absence. But it also needs to be said that D-Day David hated polygamy. Absolutely despised it. And the Fanny Alger rumor was making the rounds. It's pretty easy to see that D-Day David may have been one of the leadership that was preaching against Joe's little dirty, nasty, filthy scrape with Fanny, and the leadership that agreed with that preaching that polygamy was wrong must have sided with D-Day David. The thing is, Joe was basically unaware of this dissent that was happening in his absence. I mean, he had to have some idea, but he didn't know the details. And this is where bloody fucking Brigham sets himself apart once again from the rest of the Quorum of the 12 as one of Joe's loyal dogs. This next excerpt that I'm going to read is taken from the history manuscript of Brigham Young. Once again, it's from the Book of Abraham Project.org, and there's a link to his manuscript history in the show notes. I recommend checking it out, although it's very, very long. I've only read small excerpts of it. I haven't even read the whole thing myself. From the history of Brigham Young, quote, At this time, the spirit of speculation, disaffection, and apostasy imbibed many of the 12, and which ran through all the quorums of the church, prevailed so extensively that it was difficult for any to see clearly the path to pursue. Once again, there's in brackets the word apostasy here. I don't know who added that. On a certain occasion, several of the 12, the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, and others of the authorities of the church held a council in the upper room of the Kirtland Temple. The question before them was to ascertain how the prophet Joseph could be deposed, and David Whitmer appointed president of the church. Father John Smith, Brother Heber C. Kimball, and others were present, who were opposed to such measures. I rose up, and in a plain and forcible manner, told them that Joseph was a prophet, and I knew it, and that they might rail and slander him as much as they pleased. They could not destroy the appointment of the prophet of God. They could only destroy their own authority, cut the thread that bound them to the prophet and to God, and sink themselves to hell. Many were highly enraged at my decided opposition to their measures, and Jacob Bump, an old pugilist, was so exasperated that he could not be still. Some of the brethren near him put their hands on him and requested him to be quiet, but he writhed and twisted his arms and body, saying, "How can I keep my hands off that man?" I told him, if he thought it would give him any relief, he may lay them on. The meeting was broken up without the apostates being able to unite on any decided measures of opposition. This was a crisis when earth and hell seemed leagued to overthrow the prophet and church of God. The knees of many of the strongest men in the church faltered. During this siege of darkness, I stood close by Joseph, and, with all the wisdom and power God bestowed upon me, put forth my utmost energies to sustain the servant of God and unite the quorums of the church. So this was a huge fight that happened in the Quorum of the 12 in Joseph's absence. And Brigham is basically defending Joseph with all of his might. We'll get into, some details of that soon, but I'm going to continue on with the last paragraph here. Ascertaining that a plot was laid to waylay Joseph for the purpose of taking his life on his return from Monroe, Michigan to Kirtland, I procured a horse and buggy and took brother William Smith along to meet Joseph. We met him returning in the stagecoach. Joseph requested William to take his seat in the stage, and he rode with me in the buggy. We arrived in Kirtland in safety." End quote. Basically, the Quorum of the 12 were discussing how to either remove Joe from his throne or remove his life from him, and the problem would just take care of itself. According to Bloody Brigham, the quorum was literally trying to take Joe's life. It's pretty amazing that this early on in the church's timeline, less than 7 years after it was organized, Joe's closest counselors were plotting his death. I mean, it would take 7 more years after this plotting that we're talking about right now for one of those plots to finally go through, and we'll discuss that when it happens in Carthage. But the point I'm getting at here is how useful Bloody Brigham made himself to Joe during this time. It's a time of insurrection and infighting. If we are to believe Bloody Brigham's history, and, take that for what it's worth, it's his own manuscript history, the quorum was trying to figure out how to remove Joe one way or another, and Brigham stood up and declared Joe to be the one true prophet, which a guy, Jacob Bump, he's come up before, great last name, he wanted to go down to blows over this disagreement here. And after this dissent happened and the plots were being hatched to kill the prophet, Bloody Brigham hopped on a carriage, taking Joe's younger brother William with him, to meet Joe and company on their return trip from Salem. Once Brigham arrived and met up with Joe and Hiram and Rigdon and Ollie there, Joe asked if he could take William's place in the carriage, so Joe and Bloody Brigham, alone in the carriage, could return to Kirtland as quickly as possible. That is a servant of the prophet, making himself very, very useful. Once they returned, that's when this Wilford Woodruff's history kind of comes in, and that's where I'm going to, read this sermon that Joseph gave up after he arrived, and it's a powerful sermon. Here it goes. Quote, "He appeared much depressed, but soon the Spirit of God rested upon him, and he addressed the assembly in great plainness for about 3 hours and put his enemy to silence. When he arose, he said," now quoting Joseph here, "I am still the president, prophet, seer, revelator, and leader of the Church of Jesus Christ. God and not man has appointed and placed me in this position, and no man or set of men have power to remove me or appoint another in my stead. And those who undertake this, if they do not speedily repent, will burn their fingers and go to hell." End quote. Now, to finish up out of the Wilford Woodruff's entry here, he said, "He reproved the people sharply for their sins, darkness, and unbelief. The power of God rested upon him and bore testimony that his sayings were true." End quote of Wilford Woodruff. So, it's a powerful sermon, and I think through all of this, Bloody Brigham Young definitely earned a few brownie points on, Joe's friends list there, right? I mean, Joe's position in the church was threatened, and Bloody Brigham took that opportunity to defend Joseph and help him return to Kirtland faster than he would have been able to on the steamer as originally planned. If Brigham hadn't set himself apart before now during Zion's camp or any other time, this was a paramount moment when he became one of Joe's elect favorites that Joe knew he could trust. Now, to add in my own speculation, and, this is my speculation, take that for what it's worth. This is only my naked opinion of what happened here. But I think that this was another calculated move on Bloody Brigham's part. The only reason that I'm saying this is probably just because I've, posthumously applied a comic book villain type personality to Brigham Young, and, I've given him the name Bloody Brigham. So that's definitely coloring my perspective of what happened here, and, of the actions that Brigham took in order to solidify his position on Joe's trusted list. But personally, I think Brigham was just as disenchanted with Joe as the other dissenters in the Quorum of the 12, but during this meeting, William Smith, Joe's younger brother, was there. And whatever anybody said against Joe during this trip to Salem would be directly reported by William back to Joe once Joe returned. Of course, Brigham knew this. He knew that William wouldn't keep anything like this, like a death threat, away from Joe. So he made a grand show of defending Joe as, this one true prophet and leader of the church. And then he proceeded to take William Smith with him to go pick up Joe as quickly as possible to help him do damage control. Now, if we apply like a nefarious motivation to Brigham's defense of Joe, because he was obviously playing the long game, I think the situation makes a little more sense. Also, let's take into account the crux of the leadership's argument against Joe at this time. Most of them were so pissed off because Joe had an affair with Fanny Alger, and the word righteous polygamy was beginning to be circulated around. If the leadership had its way, polygamy would be an abomination, and Joe would be removed, and polygamy would stay an abomination. But if Joe remained prophet of the church, polygamy may actually become a righteous doctrine, where the elect few of Joe's closest friends would be able to take multiple wives. Now maybe, I'm just throwing this out there, maybe there's an ulterior motive for Brigham defending Joe that isn't readily apparent on the surface, right? If Joe remained prophet and revealed a divine dictate that polygamy was a commandment from God, Bloody Brigham could then righteously take 56 wives and then fuck them when and wherever he wanted to, right? So that's my thoughts here. I think Brigham was playing the long game here, and I'm using 2020 historical hindsight to make that claim. Just look at how the history played out. In the end, Bloody Brigham won the long game. Now, to kind of provide a bit of a parallel to this situation, as well as kind of contrast the personality to Bloody Brigham, let's briefly discuss a guy named John Cook Bennet. Now, Bennet was one of the few people that was close enough to Joe in the Nauvoo years to be considered a rightful heir to the throne. I mean, had Bennet not been excommunicated before Joe's death, that's the only problem. Bennet had been introduced in 1832 to Mormonism, and he'd attended a couple of meetings in the spring of 1835, but he never joined the church. And he just continued to follow Alexander Campbell in, the Campbellite baptism, whatever that religion was actually called. And, Campbell, of course, vehemently preached against Joe and Rigdon's Mormonite church. Now, I need to point out here, Campbell was one of the main people that, sided with Dr. Philastus Hurlbut and considered the Mormon church to be a work of Sidney Rigdon, and he even said at one point he thinks that the Book of Mormon came from the mind of Sidney Rigdon. So once 1840 rolled around, the church was really ramping up in Nauvoo, and there were, rumors circulating everywhere of like a mass polygamy ring that were, everybody knew about the Mormons or the Mormonites and how openly they were with their sex, basically. So Bennet had some kind of miraculous conversion to the church over a simple 3-letter exchange to Joe in 1840. Now, without going into too much detail, because this is going to come up in our timeline later, and I don't want to spoil everything, Bennet instantly shot up to the position of Joe's right-hand man, being called as first counselor in the presidency of the church, and, holding all kinds of other leadership positions. Many people said that during Bennet's 39 weeks as member of the church, he knew Joe more intimately than any other man on earth. Bennet had a very short stint as first counselor and then was violently excommunicated from the church after a major falling out between him and Joe. During that time, Hyrum Smith even testified against Bennet as being an abortionist to cover up his infidelity. And Hyrum went on further to accuse Bennet of providing poison to a woman so she could kill her husband, so Bennet could then fuck her without fear of being caught by her husband. I mean, there's some fucked up shit coming up here. I can't wait for it. But the contrast I'm bringing up here is the fast and loose game that Bennet played with his position in the church and the violent and abrupt end to which it came, as opposed to Bloody Brigham being much more cool and calculated playing the long game. Bennet was... this is kind of the way I see it, but Bennet was kind of like Joe's tequila, right? As soon as Joe took a shot, Bennet jumped to the forefront of the leadership, affecting all kinds of changes and reformations. Joe, after that, Joe was feeling good and he's, started taking a few more shots and he felt even better and, everything was going really well. John Bennet was really good at, aborting the fetuses that Joe was putting into teenagers all around Nauvoo. So that was really convenient. And, so Joe just kept taking more and more shots of Bennet here, Eventually, it all caught up with Joe and a catastrophic falling out exploded into a blackout of anger and drunken stupidity. A lot of people got hurt, friendships were lost, and Joe woke up the next morning feeling like shit, wondering what the actual fuck happened last night. However, if we contrast that with Brigham was a little bit more like cigarettes for Joe. He was always there for Joe to fall back on. I mean, he joined the church very early on and slowly made his climb to more and more prominence. His whole family joined up with the church, Joseph and Phineas Young, so on and so forth. Eventually, Brigham was called to the Quorum of the 12. Yeah, and any time that Joe needed a little pick-me-up or a little bit of help, Brigham was always there to rely on. Bloody Brigham took slow, calculated measures to ensure his position right next to Joe, slowly infecting Joe's good graces, edging ever closer to killing Joe with his Bloody Brigham cancer. As the years ticked by, Joe started relying more and more on Brigham, just taking more and more drags on the cigarettes, until finally in 1844 the cancer took over and Joe ended up dead. But that was just the beginning of the bloody infection. Yeah, I cannot wait to get to the Utah years. But all that being said, that was merely my speculation on why Bloody Brigham did what he did in going to pick up Joe in the horse and buggy on their way back from Salem, Massachusetts, right? He became a crutch for Joe to rely on at this vital moment in Mormon history. When the church was about to fall into the hands of D-Day David Whitmer, and, an assassination plot was being hatched to kill Joseph Smith, Brigham Young was there to take care of Joe, thus solidifying his place above D-Day David and many, many others in Joe's friends list. And I have to admit, Joe handled the dissent well. All things considered, he was able to put a cap on it for a short time, One thing that may have helped, D-Day David Whitmer in this shadow campaign to overthrow Joe was the death of his brothers. Joe was able to stop this campaign and stop people from, actually usurping Joe's throne with D-Day David Whitmer. But D-Day David lost his brothers, and that was a very big thing that I think won, kind of sympathy points for the members of the church. Since Joe was translating the plates, we've had the three brothers, D-Day David Whitmer, John Goebbels Whitmer, and Peter Whitmer Jr., and with a fourth brother that was kind of in the background, Christian Whitmer. For this reason, I've kind of neglected giving Peter Whitmer Jr. and Christian Whitmer their own name on nicknames, because they die. This is the time when they die. If there were anybody that was more eligible to be a leader of the church, D-Day David was it. He was kind of at the forefront. If it wasn't going to be Oliver Cowdery, if it wasn't going to be anybody else, it was going to be D-Day David Whitmer. His brother, John Goebbels Whitmer, was basically running the church in far west Missouri, while Peter Whitmer Jr. was basically running the church in Liberty, Missouri. The other main haven for members that were chased out of independence. And of course, while Joe was digging for treasure in Salem, D-Day David was basically running the church in Kirtland. I mean, this dream team of three brothers were all running the church in its three main locations, while Joe, Ollie, Rigdon, and Hiram Smith were all occupied treasure digging in Massachusetts. Well, on September 22nd, 1836, Peter Whitmer Jr. died, presumably of tuberculosis, and his brother Christian Whitmer died very soon after, probably from the same ailment. This must have served to win some sympathy points for D-Day David with the followers of the church. I mean, nothing helps a person to empathize or pity another as much as a death in the family, especially when it's two deaths of other prominent leaders in the church. And, these guys were all, members of the 8 witnesses of the gold plates. So they were very important members of the church. So with September of 1836, we bid Peter Whitmer Jr. and Christian Whitmer goodbye and a swift escape from our historical timeline. Any pages on church websites about these guys are fairly bare, probably because the Whitmers weren't affiliated with the church after the defection day. The Wikipedia pages for these guys are both less than 5 sentences long. I mean, it's sad. These guys really, on the face of it, didn't contribute very much more to the timeline, especially because their two older brothers, D-Day David Whitmer and John Goebbels Whitmer, were such prominent members of the church, with, D-Day David being one of the 3 witnesses, and John Goebbels Whitmer being the church's first official historian and one of the 8 witnesses. I mean, it's kind of sad that these guys just make an escape like this early on. They missed a lot. There was so much more that was going on that was going to happen in the future, and these guys missed out because of tuberculosis. It's a good thing we have vaccines for that now. Well, it's been a fun run, Christian and Peter. Thank you so much for your contributions, but your time with us has drawn to a close, and you will both be missed for your very, very few contributions to our historical timeline. But let's not dwindle on the deaths too much that happened nearly 180 years ago. Let's see what happens after their death in the wake of this, because now we're getting into some real prominent dissent, all leading up to Defection Day, after which D-Day David Whitmer is nicknamed. All right, we are approaching the end of 1836 now, and we're about to move into the tumultuous peril that is 1837, but there are a few more important things to cover before closing up 1836. One thing we need to cover is a little theological dispute between Hingepin Rigdon and Ollie Cowdung. As we know, the Messenger and Advocate was the church's monthly newspaper, where everything from mission callings to doctrinal decrees to obituaries were published, right? In the November 1836 article of the Messenger and Advocate, Hingepin Rigdon took a few articles to discuss some finer points of doctrine and epistemology of the Mormon God. The first extract we're going to read is from the front page article of the November 36 article, and it's titled The Latter Day Glory. This is taken from a photocopy of the original newspaper, and it's hosted on the online BYU library. There will be a link to it in the show notes for the paper if you want to read Hingepin Rigdon's entire sermon on how we know what we know about God. I mean, it's a lot of typical preacher dribble, so trust me, I'm sparing you a lot of boring details here. But before this excerpt, he was talking about other prominent religions in this area. And, of course, this will be linked in the show notes, November 1836 of the Messenger and Advocate. Quote, "Now, these all believe in the second coming of the Savior," talking about the other religions, "and that a great glory will follow. But they differ about the events which will precede that advent, and about what the glory will be when it comes. And on these points, they frequently grow wrathy, denounce each other as heretics, fanatics, enthusiasts, etc., etc., and deal out their anathemas against one another with a liberal hand. It is in relation to these things that the Church of the Latter-day Saints has been so shamefully abused and belied by all other parties, both Jews and Gentiles, reformers and non-reformers, not even excepting the pious Alexander Campbell and old Clapp, his Sancho Panza, and the will-making Adamson Bentley, one of his flunkies. Not that they do not believe in the second coming of the Savior, and in the glory that shall follow, but because they differ from all the other parties about the means by which the Savior will prepare the way of his second coming, and what the glory will be which will follow." End quote. Alright, the reason we just read that excerpt is to properly understand the religious fervor that was going on surrounding Mormonism. You know, Alexander Campbell historically was one of the most outspoken detractors of Mormon theology, and we know that Rigdon used to preach Campbellism, and he learned how to be a preacher under Alexander Campbell, you know, before, of course, he broke off to make his own religion. We also know that Adamson Bentley and Rigdon used to be best friends and roommates while they studied under Alexander Campbell. Yet Rigdon took this opportunity in the front page of the Messenger and Advocate to disparage Bentley's perspective of theology, as well as, you know, Campbell's. This just goes to show how toxic it really was between the various sects of Christianity that were cropping up all over the Burned-Over district and the surrounding areas. But Rigdon didn't stop there. And this is what we really need to talk about here. This is the important part. You see, Rigdon was a polarizing guy, right? He had his own thoughts on theology, and he seemed to insert these into Mormonism wherever he saw fit, whether his opinions were welcome or not. But Rigdon was Joe's second in command at this time, having usurped that position from Ollie back in 1832. So his opinions and personal theology played a big part in shaping the Mormonism that we know today. So let's read another excerpt from the same November 1836 issue of the Messenger and Advocate. This time the article is titled Perfection Number 2. Quote, "For a person to be an heir of God and a joint heir with Christ Jesus would be to endow him with the powers of the great God." Ooh, that's exciting. The powers of the great God, like the priesthood. "For how can any person be an heir of God and yet never partake of either his power or glory? Where would his heirship be? A mere fiction, as bad as a Methodist God, without either body or parts." That's the important part. As bad as a Methodist God without either body or parts. Rigdon is saying that if somebody believes in a God that doesn't have a body or body parts, then that's as bad as a Methodist God. That's anathema, basically. "If a person is ever to be an heir of God, he will partake of his glory, and this he cannot do unless he first partakes of his power." End quote. So many people wonder when Mormonism became the religion of, like, the members becoming gods. Well, here we see the very beginnings of such controversial beliefs. And it continues on to really describe what I'm talking about here. Quote, "Or if a person is ever a joint heir with Christ Jesus, he will be so by reason of his partaking of the same power and glory. And the Savior said of himself that," and now this is quoting Jesus apparently, "all power is given unto me in heaven and on earth." Now going back to Rigdon. "Now may I not ask, with propriety, can a person be a joint heir with him who has all power in heaven and on earth, and yet have no power in heaven nor on earth? This would be too paradoxical for any rational being to pretend to believe. For any rational being must know that for a person to be a joint heir with another requires nothing less than to equally partake of the power, by which that other person partook of and enjoyed his heirship, for if he did not, he never could be heir with him." End quote. Basically, what Rigdon is saying there, it's awful confusing, and like I said, I parsed out a lot of typical preacher dribble. This was like the important parts that I distilled out of this. But according to the line that Jesus spoke, you know, he quoted it here, "All power is given unto me in heaven and on earth." You know, according to Rigdon, we would be heirs of the same kingdom of Jesus, and therefore be subject to all of the same gifts and magical powers that Jesus has. This was Class A premium blasphemy to most Christians that believe Jesus to be God, because it was placing humans on the same level as Jesus, elevating us disgusting sinners to the level of being gods. Most Christians today call Mormonism blasphemy for this very reason. I mean, this is one point of theology where Mormonism kind of jumps into a league of its own, and Rigdon was behind it from the very beginning in 1836. This point right here that we're talking about is where Mormonism started to form some of its really weird beliefs on, the followers becoming gods of their own. Now, I have to point out, when Rigdon released this article and elevated the saints to the same level of Jesus, saying that they're going to get the same inheritance and superpowers as Jesus, people lost their fucking minds, right? Alexander Campbell had been preaching against Mormonism since 1831, and all of his ilk were on the same warpath to try and discredit Rigdon and the Mormonites, or at least brand them with the label of blasphemers. So what I'm going to read next is an excerpt from a newspaper article that was published in the Ohio Observer, published August 11th, 1836, and it was titled Mormonism, written by Truman Co. It's quite a fascinating piece of anti-Mormon smear literature. The thing is, I can't find any factual inaccuracies in the entire thing. Now, I implore you to read the entire article for yourself and come to your own conclusion. There will be a link to this article from the Ohio Observer titled Mormonism, written by Truman Cole, in the show notes, and I recommend reading it. We're going to read a fair amount of it, but not the entire thing. But it's fascinating to say the least. There's a lot of very interesting information here. Now, quoting from Truman Co., quote, "The Mormons to a man all abhor priests and priestcraft and societies and the whole system of religious institutions among established circles. And yet they themselves are the most obsequious and abject slaves to the spiritual rule of their leaders." Oh my God, if only he saw the 2015 church. "All their affairs, small and great, are directed by spiritual revelation, by a miserable attempt to ape the language and style of Scripture that clothe their commands with the authority of heaven, and the people have nothing to do but hear and obey." Right? Like Joseph, whenever he'd come up with a revelation, it was from God, so everybody has to obey. "If the prophet demands their money for the Lord's treasury, he can have it by uttering a 'Thus saith the Lord.'" Oh my God, so well said, right? "By these sacrifices, they give what among selfish men would be called a pretty good proof of sincerity, at least. Thus it happens that those who complain loudest of priestcraft are the most woefully priest-ridden of all men." So the term he's using, priestcraft, there is basically, reserving your teachings until people give you money. And that's exactly what the church does today. And that's the definition of priestcraft back then, when it was actually, the term was coined, or the term was frequently used in the 1830s. It's not the priestcraft that we think of today that the church says, "Oh, well, we don't have any paid clergy, therefore we don't have any priestcraft." That's not exactly what priestcraft meant back then. Well, it was putting your religious beliefs behind a paywall, basically. And the church is great at that. And even back into the 1830s, when the church was established, it was still doing the same thing. Anyway, continuing here. "In regard to their religious sentiments, the fundamental principle of Mormonism is that God continues to hold intercourse with the saints on earth by visions and revelations, as freely and familiarly as he has done in any age of the world. That the true church have the same power to cast out devils, to speak with new tongues, to take up serpents, to drink poison unhurt, and to recover the sick by laying on of hands. They make great use of the declaration of our Savior in Mark 16, 17, and 18, and strenuously contend that the promise applies to all that believe in every age. They contend that God worshipped by the Presbyterians and all other sectarians is no better than a wooden god. They believe that the true God is a material being composed of body and parts. Oh, there's what we're talking about. And that when the Creator formed Adam in his own image, he made him about the size and shape of God himself. They believe in the final restoration of all men except apostate Mormons. For them, they go to outer darkness. Everybody else is restored. They blaspheme against the Holy Ghost and can never have forgiveness, neither in this world, neither in the world to come. Their avowed object is to restore Christianity to its primeval purity. In the true style of fanaticism, they regard themselves as the exclusive favorites of heaven, and the whole religious world as a natural brute beasts that know nothing. After the example of our Savior, they have recently ordained and commissioned 12 apostles and 70 elders to go throughout this heathen country and to give a final call to repent and be baptized and believe in Mormonism before the wicked are cut off. The people of this region are viewed by them as standing in the place of Chorazin and Bethsaida, Bethsaida, sure, why not? And Capernaum, unwilling to believe in spite of all the mighty works they have tried to perform. Those must be biblical characters. They are habitually pretending to speak in tongues and to the working of miracles, but nobody can have any evidence of these wonders but those who have Mormon eyes and Mormon ears. Oh, isn't that just so perfect? They say they can do all of these things, but you can only do them if you have Mormon eyes and Mormon ears. Only if you believe in the church do any of these things actually work. It's absolutely amazing. Truman Co. continues, and this whole article is so fascinating. Like I said, please go read the whole thing. A link is in the show notes because it's really, really amazing. But I'm going to continue reading because he says some very interesting things here that I think need to be called out, because oftentimes people say, well, the missionaries or the priesthood or leaders or whoever, I was sick, they laid their hands on me, and now I'm feeling great. Well, let's talk about this. When they first came to Kirtland, Mr. Rigdon joined them, and a few families followed in his train. But otherwise, of the former inhabitants, scarce a single conversion has happened since. The fact is that the people are well assured that all their pretentious to miraculous gifts of every kind are a sheer imposition. But whenever any miracle fails, they have a convenient salve at hand to account for the failure. That is the want of faith, a most impudent and officious intruder, always ready at hand to nullify all their pious efforts and to render them weak and feeble as other men. Basically, what he said there is, as soon as one of their miracles work, it's great, but as soon as one of the miracles fail, they'll say, oh, well, it's because you didn't have enough faith. It's exactly the way that every church ever works, ever. It's amazing. I'm going to continue here. Instances frequently occur which may serve as examples of their power of healing. A young man lying on his bed of sickness sent after Smith and his elders to come heal him. After praying over him, anointing him with oil, there's that anointing oil again, in the name of the Lord, he commanded the disease to depart, pronounced him healed, and ordered him to rise and walk. Stimulated by the circumstances and by high expectation, the youth rose up and attempted to walk. But presently, becoming faint, by the help of bystanders, he betook himself to the bed again and grew worse. Amazing, right? Hey, you will be healed. Now walk, stand and arise and walk around. And he, the kid was all amped up on the energy and the anointing oil he was just anointed with, whatever that anointing oil was. He stood up and then fainted immediately after. Amazing. And after that, apparently he grew worse. Coe continues here. They, of course, imputed his sudden relapse to the failure of his faith. He then sent for the regular physician, and by faithful means he recovered. Right. Joseph wasn't able to heal him, so they sent for an actual physician and he recovered. Weird how that works. Another late instance was a young woman lying at the point of death with the measles. Oh, horrible. The elders were called to lay hands on her in like manner, and very soon afterwards she was a corpse. Whoa. Oh, powerful. The prophet has undergone repeated trials before the church and has made frequent confessions, and among the faithful this is accounted as additional proof of his humility and divine inspiration. They only class his failings with those recorded of the ancient prophets. But the faith of many among them has failed, and they have had honesty enough to confess it. They have opened their eyes, the delusion has vanished, and they have been astonished at their besotted infatuation. Frequent depredations have happened among them, and it has sometimes required the art and assiduity of all their prophets and priests and elders to keep the whole Babel from tumbling down together. End quote. So, this is just one article. There are a bunch of them out there from, the Ohio Observer. And, like I said, please read the whole thing. It's fascinating. Truman Co. does a great job of his recounting of Mormonism. But this does go to show that a lot of people were out there publishing articles against Mormonism, against the flesh and blood God of Mormonism, against their supposedly miraculous healing claims and their speaking in tongues in new languages. I mean, people were going on these exposés all the time about Mormonism, and there's no shortage of them. That's the best part about it. So the next one that I'm going to read another one, and it's actually from the Painesville Telegraph. It was published May of 1836. Now, if we remember back, Eber Howe, who was the author of Mormonism Unveiled, published in late 1834, was still the editor-in-chief of the Painesville Telegraph when this was published, and he was still mired in his crusade against the Mormon Church. He was actually making a living publishing anti-Mormon articles. Unfortunately, we don't know who wrote this. It's not signed, but it was published in the Telegraph, and it was titled Mormonism, which there will be a link for it in the show notes. Quote, I have been to Kirtland and witnessed the operations of that most deluded set of visionaries that our land or any other enlightened land has ever witnessed. You would naturally suppose that the Mormons were the most ignorant, degraded, and stupid set of beings on the face of the earth. This is true of some of them, but there are not wanting men of sagacity and information, and some men of strong powers of mind. From what I saw, I should suppose that they were generally real believers in the doctrines of their prophet. They are quite polite and affable with strangers and ready to unfold the whole system as far as they know it until you press them with an argument, and then their wrath rises, or they assume an air of awful superiority and dogmatically pronounce you blind and ignorant and in the way of destruction, whereas they know the certainty of all these things whereof they affirm. Isn't that so true of Mormons today? Like, they know that they have all of the facts. Like, I've heard, I can't remember the apostle that it was, but I saw a video of one of the apostles, and I think this was on the Mormons PBS documentary. He said, we are basically, other Christian sects are basically high school of Christianity, whereas Mormonism is like college. We have the fullness of the gospel of it. Like, we have the extra teachings of it. But it's so great, like when you press them with an argument, their wrath rises or they assume an air of awful superiority and dogmatically pronounce you blind and ignorant in the way of destruction. That's like, whoever wrote this so beautifully encapsulated Mormons back then and even today. It's amazing that the attitude of Mormons and their air of superiority has never died in the 180 years since this was printed. It's just amazing, isn't it? To continue on here, they profess to believe the common Bible firmly, but they have received additional revelations which contain the fullness of the gospel. They all have revelations in proportion to their faith. I was introduced to the immortal prophet Joe Smith and his renowned coadjutor Sidney Rigdon and a host of the inferior satellites, and could scarcely suppress a laugh during the formality of making acquaintance and shaking hands with the exalted dignitaries, high priests, etc. of Mormonism, right? Right? You're meeting these people. Oh, I am the prophet. Oh, I am the first counselor. Oh, I am a member of the quorum of the 12 apostles. Yeah, how can you suppress a laugh at that? That's amazing. I have no doubt that Joe Smith's character is an equal compound of impostor and fanatic. Wow. Yeah, right? Imposter and fanatic. And that Rigdon has but a small spice of the latter, being a fanatic, with an extraordinary portion of the former, being an impostor, right? While the mass of the disciples are men of perverted intellect and disordered piety, with no sound principles of religion, with minds unbalanced and unfurnished, but active and devout. inclined to the mystical and dreary, and ready to believe any extraordinary announcement as a revelation from God. Oh, wow, right? Oh, that's so beautiful. So well said. You have Joseph, who was equal parts imposter and fanatic, and Rigdon, who was a little bit fanatical, but much more of an imposter. That's exactly how I've constructed these guys in my brain, probably because I've read a bunch of these so-called anti-Mormon pieces of literature, and that just seems to be what shines through, even when you're reading the pro-Mormon literature as well. But anyway, the people that are believers in the church are always ready to believe any announcement as a revelation from God, as long as it comes from the Quorum of the 12, or comes down from Rigdon, or comes from Joe, or whatever. It's printed in the Messenger and Advocate. It's revelation, and we believe it. It's amazing. None of them appear to be within reach of argument on the subject of religion. Right? Same today. You can't argue with Mormons very well. They profess to have the gift of tongues, and one individual, after becoming very much excited in conversation, offered to give me a specimen, and began to close his throat for that purpose. But I shuddered at the proposal to exhibit such blasphemy and mockery of a miraculous gift, and he desisted. So whoever wrote this, apparently when he met one of the Mormons, the guy said, "Hey, I can speak in tongues just like all of us do in the congregation. I'll show you if you want." And he was about to start speaking in tongues, but the guy was like, "No, this is just so stupid. I'm walking away." Amazing. The Mormons have increased with astonishing rapidity. They say, and they are probably not far from the truth, that their numbers in the United States amount to about 45,000 people. Now, that number, I think, is up for dispute. By 1836, 6 years into the church, I think that they were closer to about 20,000 people. The problem is the numbers are so fickle. If you read there's something that we're going to read from later is an Oliver Cowdery article talking about the end of the year, basically. He's doing an end of year summation in the Messenger and Advocate, talking about how great the year has been. We're going to read an excerpt from it, but something I didn't include in that excerpt is talking about the numbers of the church. And Ollie himself said the numbers have grown too fast for us to possibly record them all here, which is great. You know, I understand that people were flocking to the Mormons, but if you read a lot of this anti-Mormon literature, the numbers fluctuate so much. I mean, 45,000, I've never seen a number that high, even during 1836, be claimed that was how many, members were there. I mean, in the highest days of, when Nauvoo was at its thriving point, at the highest number of Mormons, where most of the Mormons were living, they were about 20,000. And that was, 6 years after what we're talking about right now. So 45,000 in 1836, that's a little bit inflated, I think. I think that's, given my own estimations, I think that's about double of what the actual number was. But let me read one more paragraph out of this article, because it's really awesome, and it just goes to substantiate what we read out of the Ohio Observer earlier. Their temple at Kirtland is a huge, misshapen edifice that comes nearer to the Gothic than any other style of architecture. The pattern, like everything else connected with Mormonism, was given by direct revelation from heaven, and given to 3 individuals separately so that there could be no doubt on the subject. They assure you with the utmost confidence that they shall soon be able to raise the dead, heal the sick, the deaf, the dumb, and the blind, etc. Indeed, more than one assured me that they had themselves, by the laying on of hands, restored the sick to health. Isn't that amazing? We read that thing out of the Ohio Observer earlier, and this is just substantiating exactly what they were claiming. Oh, we have the power of healing. But it goes on to say exactly what we're talking about. The difficulty with their miracles, and the distinction between all false and true miracles, is that the former are done in private, with few, if any, witnesses, while the latter are wrought in open day before the whole world, friends and foes. The delusion, however, is one which, I am inclined to think, is likely to spread rapidly for a season, especially where there is ignorance combined with a love of the marvelous and a mystical, distempered, and extravagant tone of piety. End quote. So he's saying, the problem with the Mormons and their healing practices is they're all done in just like little groups of people, and there's very few witnesses, and they're all done in private, right? Whereas real miracles, like the ones that Jesus did, were wrought in open day before the entire world of friends and foes, so one of them is diluted and the other one isn't. I tend to believe that faith healers are all kind of the same, tapping into that same human emotion that makes people feel like they're healed, but it doesn't actually do any healing. My own second or third great grandfather, William Moroni Palmer, was known to be blind. And he was blessed by the prophet of the church to, that he would no longer be blind. And he had this feeling, and it's recounted that he was healed from his blindness. But then when you go to hear stories later on, he, had to hold a Bible, mere inches from his face in order to read it. And there was a fireside discussion where he was, reading from the Bible to a bunch of the people that were, sitting around the fireside. And he was just reading straight out of the Bible, and the people began to kind of, snicker a little bit, and they were laughing because the Bible was upside down and he didn't realize it. If he were actually cured of his blindness, that wouldn't have been a thing. He wouldn't have had to hold the Bible inches from his face in order to see it. So it's the same idea of like faith healing, where they claim that the person is healed and no actual healing happens. Endorphins fly through the person's body, whatever. Chemicals fly through their body, making them feel like they're healed for a very short amount of time. But as soon as they come off of that endorphin high, they're still sick. They were not healed by any actual realistic measure of what healing actually is. So, I take all the faith healers of any mystery religion, of Jesus, of Mormons, of any faith healer. I just take them very skeptically and say that they're all full of bullshit. Anyway, so back to the point here. There was no shortage of newspaper articles that were being published all over that were, chastising Mormonism or just calling it out on its bullshit at any given time, right? Most articles considered Joe and Rigdon to be the main guys running the show. And as we read in that previous article, Joe was a bit more fanatical, while Rigdon was much more of a pious imposter here. The reason that I'm bringing up all of these articles is to illustrate an overall point. If we want to know where so much of Mormon beliefs come from, one need look no further than Hingepin Sidney Rigdon. So much of Mormon beliefs hinged on Sidney Rigdon, and that's why he has his nickname. If not for him, the church wouldn't be what it was back then and what it is today. The article that I read from the Messenger and Advocate, where Rigdon kind of fleshed out the finer points of Mormon doctrine, was fantastically illustrative of my point here. Mormons believe that God is the flesh and bone Father of Jesus Christ, who is a separate being of flesh and bone. And that was something that was radically opposed to the Book of Mormon and the Second Lecture on Faith contained in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. And until 1836, the teaching of the church was basically Trinitarian, where they claimed that, Jesus was 100% God and 100% God, and, that 3-in-1 water, steam, and ice bullshit that, it doesn't make any sense to me, but that's just because it doesn't actually make any sense at all. So that's why it doesn't make sense to me. But once 1836 rolled around, Rigdon started to insert his own theology into official Mormon doctrine. In fact, that November Messenger and Advocate article is the first official printed claim we have of God being flesh and bone from one of the church leaders. And of course, it had to come from Sidney Rigdon. It was probably a teaching before November of 1836, because the articles we read, specifically the Ohio Observer, that was from August of 1836. And this was, the article we read from Sidney Rigdon was published in November of 1836. So it was probably a teaching before November, being preached from the pulpit by Rigdon and maybe Joe. But this is the first time that it was actually found in print and made as an official declaration of the church. From Rigdon's teachings here, we can see the evolution of Mormon claims that God was once a person. And by the time 1841 rolls along, we have Joe preaching this from the pulpit. Quote, "The earth was organized or formed out of other planets which were broke up and remodeled and made into the one on which we live. The elements are eternal. Scientifically speaking, that's not completely wrong. I mean, the elements aren't eternal if we, rewind the clock back to the Big Bang. But, I mean, the fact that the Earth was made out of, formed out of other planets and stars that were broken up, that's actually scientifically simplistic, but somewhat accurate. Interesting. But he goes on to say some other things that are much less, scientifically verifiable. Anyway, that which is without body or parts is nothing. There is no other God in heaven but that God who has flesh and bones. God the Father took life unto himself precisely as Jesus did. The first step in the salvation of men is the laws of eternal and self-existent principles. Spirits are eternal. At the first organization in heaven, we were all present and saw the Savior chosen and appointed, and the plan of salvation made, and we sanctioned it. Now, TBMs or, ex-Mormons understand everything we're talking about. Nevermos are probably, what the hell are you talking about? I'm not going to go into it. We'll get into it later. We came to this earth that we might have a body and present it pure before God in the celestial kingdom. The great principle of happiness consists of having a body. The devil has no body, and herein is his punishment. All beings who have bodies have power over those who have not. That was a sermon that Joseph Smith said in 1841. Once you take this into account, beings that have bodies have power over those that do not. God has a body of flesh and bone, just like Jesus has a body of flesh and bone, so on and so forth. You start to have the evolution of Mormon folklore spawning from claims like this that, if you want to test whether a spirit is of the devil or of God, all you needed to do is shake hands with it. Now, a spirit of the devil doesn't have a body, therefore it's unable to shake your hand, whereas a spirit of God has a body and will shake your hand. I know, the bullshit thickens, right? I mean, it's just crazy, isn't it? But when Rigdon declared that God has a body of flesh and bone in November of 1836, it was met with internal opposition. It was an official church declaration that made the front page news in the Mormon periodical Messenger and Advocate, which Ollie Cowdung was the chief editor of, and it was circulated to every subscriber of that newspaper. The problem is, this nuanced stance on humans being elevated to the same level of Jesus and God having a body of flesh and bone didn't sit well with some of the members of the church, namely Ollie, who took the front page of the Messenger and Advocate of the following month, December of 1836, to air out his own theology, which seemed to come into a bit of conflict with Rigdon's claims of God having, finite flesh and blood like all of us do. This is from the December Messenger and Advocate of 1836. There's a link for it in the show notes, and it's Oliver Cowdery's own discussion and treatise on what he understands as the nature of God. Quote, "The next and great point is that which believes in a God who is eternal. To constitute such a being must be one that never changes." Now, this is where, the idea of a finite body and flesh and bone is inconsistent with Ollie's interpretation of an infinite God. To attach his attributes changeableness at once argues finitude, and how any rational man can spread out his hands towards heaven and worship in his mind such a being is past our comprehension. Such is not the God we adore. It is not the being we serve. The one we worship comprehends all things from the extent of eternity to the rippling crimson that flows and throbs through our hearts. No power so high that he does not surpass it, no depth so low that he does not comprehend it, and no extent so great that it is not circumscribed by his omniscient wisdom. And yet, great as he is, he so abounds in goodness that, as a shepherd watches over his flock, carrying the feeble in his arms, so does our God condescend to notice our wants and answer the petitions of the orphan and the outcast. End quote. And I have to take a second here. Calling God a shepherd is really unpleasant. I really don't like that. I believe it was Christopher Hitchens who said, "I didn't like being called a member of the flock because a shepherd doesn't, herd sheep because he likes them or because he loves them. He does it because he wants to eat them, fleece them, or fuck them." and I don't want to be associated with anybody that calls himself a shepherd over me. So, I just have to say that I don't like to be called a member of the flock because, Christopher Hitchens said it so well. Well said. But anyway, to go back to what we were talking about here, while it may not be, completely apparent and contradictory, a finite God of flesh and bone as opposed to a spirit God that is eternal and infinite, I think we do begin to see something very interesting happening here. Throughout our time studying Joe, one thing we've come to learn is the fact that he was pragmatic, right? He may have carried a certain set of delusions about himself and his own church, but when it came down to decision time, he was practical in many respects. The Joe that I've constructed in my brain, take that for what it's worth, wasn't necessarily argumentative, but rather was capable of adjusting his own opinions based on the best argument presented. When it came to people fundamentally disagreeing with him about something, like, say, his brother William in the last episode, Joe didn't mind defending his own opinions, even if that meant going down on knuckles. But for the most part, I see Joe as being able to be swayed by the best argument, oftentimes siding with the best orator. In the case of Ollie's construct of a timeless and immutable God, as opposed to Rigdon's finite God of flesh and blood, one of them had to have a better argument that Joe sided with. Now, we understand Mormon doctrine today to follow the tired old trope of, I'm messing it up here, but it's something along the lines of, as we are, God once was, as God is, we may someday become. Meaning that God was once a human being living on Kolob or on the planet nearest the star Kolob or whatever the teaching is. It confuses Mormon apologists even today. But, the overall point is God was once a human that went through puberty and has testicles and a belly button just like every other man. Elohim's parents chastised him for masturbating. His bishop had biannual interviews to make sure that he wasn't necking with any of the warty girls or, universe forbid he wasn't gay, right? This perspective of God wouldn't come along until a little bit further on in our timeline, but Rigdon making an argument that God is a human being of flesh and bone was the first step towards this doctrine being embraced by the early LDS church. Now, Ollie's perspective of God, however, was much more mainstream Christian. And if there was anything that Joe didn't like, it was mainstream shit. So the arguments that claimed God as being the infinite, unchangeable God in spirit form as preached in the Lectures of Faith since 1832 were kind of old news to Joe. And they were too conformist with the beliefs of other Christian sects that were declared enemies of Mormonism, such as Campbellism and other, Methodists and everything. So Joe slowly began to side with Rigdon in this case. Once more, pushing Ollie to the role of benchwarmer and solidifying Rigdon's seat as Joe's second in command. Now, it's important to keep tabs on Joe and Ollie's relationship as we move through the rest of 1836 and on into early 1837, but I'm afraid we won't be opening up the Pandora's box that is 1837 on this episode, because we have one more huge topic to discuss in 1836, and that's going to take us to the end of the historical portion of today's episode. This is a big topic, and we'll have to touch into January of 1837 to get the entire story. But the first mention of this comes up on November 2nd, 1836, and this is taken out of the History of the Church, Volume 2, page 467. Quote, "On the 2nd of November, the brethren at Kirtland drew up certain articles of agreement preparatory to the organization of a banking institution to be called the Kirtland Safety Society. President Oliver Cowdery, Ollie Cowden, was delegated to Philadelphia to procure plates for the institution, and Elder Orson Hyde, Orson Lachaidem, to repair to Columbus with a petition to the legislature of Ohio for an act of incorporation which was presented at an early period of their sessions. But, because we were Mormons, in quotes, the legislature raised some frivolous excuse on which they refused to grant us those banking privileges they so freely granted to others. Thus, Elder Hyde, Lachaidem, was compelled to return without accomplishing the object of his mission, while Elder Ollie Cowdery succeeded at a great expense in procuring the plates and bringing them to Kirtland." End quote. That's right. Now is the time in the Mormon historical timeline when the Kirtland Safety Society was established. There was something else established concurrent to the Kirtland Safety Society at the end of 1836 that isn't known about in pretty much any Mormon historical circles. But I'm just teasing that for now, and that'll be the final thing that we talk about today. So right now, let's discuss the Kirtland Safety Society. First off, we have to ask why they sought to establish a bank in the first place. The simple answer is debt. And if you're wondering why they were denied a charter to be a legitimate bank by the Ohio legislature, the simple answer is debt. The history of the church records the reason the Ohio legislature denied their application as being, religious persecution, right? It specifically said, but because we were Mormons, the legislature raised some frivolous excuse on which they refused to grant us those banking privileges, right? I would be willing to bet that the legislature didn't grant those privileges because they were Mormons, but not because of disagreements with their religious beliefs, but because they were fucking Mormons. The members of this church were squatting on land in Ohio, Missouri, New York, and just about anywhere else they had large numbers of membership because the church was perpetually defaulting on their massive amounts of debt. The temple itself put the church back anywhere from 30 to 40,000. And they had plenty of debt before the temple was erected that, was finally coming back to bite them in the ass. If the legislature had granted them status as a legitimate bank, the people that signed that charter could be held liable for the money that the church printed once it defaulted on all of those banknotes as well. This is simple economics. You can't be a bank if you don't have any money. If you have negative money, you can't be a bank even more so. I mean, they obviously chalked this up to religious persecution. That's what we read. But I don't think that was very sincere. I'd be willing to bet that every single member of the church leadership that tried to start this safety society knew exactly what would happen when they petitioned the government for a bank charter. They would be denied for lack of assets. Simple as that. And that's what happened. However, anybody that was a member of the church, not in the leadership, that didn't understand simple economics or didn't know that the church was in over $1 million of today's money in debt, those people would think that the state of Ohio just hated Mormons and denied it because they believed in Mormonism, which, only added to the already mounting religious persecution narrative that had been building up and, piling up for years, right? In all honesty, starting the Safety Society was one of the smartest things Joe and Rigdon could have done in the long run. I mean, it fucked them over really hard in 1838, and they didn't see that coming, obviously, but for over a year, they were flying high and had shitloads of money to blow on anything they wanted. The money was only as valuable as the paper it was printed on, right? But they had cash in hand. And to anybody that doesn't understand the first thing about economics, which described the majority of the members of the church back then, cash was all that mattered. So to move us into this discussion about the Kirtland Safety Society, I'm going to read an excerpt from the autobiography of Ebenezer Robinson, which I relied on quite a bit in episode 35 because it's amazing. And the link for the entire autobiography as hosted on the BYU servers on the Book of Abraham project is going to be linked in the show notes. Ebenezer Robinson, and it's in the episode 35 show notes as well as this episode. And I really, really recommend reading his entire autobiography. It's chocked full of really amazing, reliable first-hand information from a believer in the church. This is from Ebenezer Robinson's autobiography. Quote, as stated above, Orson Hyde failed in securing a bank charter, but Oliver Cowdery returned with Kirtland bank bills printed to amount, it was said, of $200,000, which would be worthless unless some way could be devised by which they could be used. To meet this emergency, the following action was had, which we quote from Joseph Smith history as found on page 843 of the Millennial Star, end quote. So then it goes on to read the establishment of the articles of agreement for the Kirtland Safety Society that was published in the Millennial Star, but we find it, of course, in the History of the Church, Volume 2 now. But to talk about what Ebenezer Robinson just said just now, $200,000, right? Let's put that in perspective. The church had anywhere from, $40,000 to $50,000 in total debt, or about $1.2 million in today's money. Ollie printed $200,000 in Kirtland Safety Society bank money, which is equivalent to about $5.13 million in today's cash. Basically, Joe and Rigdon said, when we play by the rules and use everybody else's economy, we go into debt. So fuck all of you, we're gonna make our own economy and then we'll be filthy fucking rich. We're goddamn millionaires when we make our own rules. The problem is, the notes had been printed for the Kirtland Safety Society Bank, which failed for the bank charter application when Orson LaHaydon went to apply for it at the Ohio legislature. And everybody knew that. That was well known in the church when it failed. So Joe and Rigdon came up with a genius plan to get out of this bucket of syrup. Instead of handing out meaningless paper for a bank that was denied legitimacy by the Ohio legislature, they founded a company by the name of the Kirtland Safety Society, that's the same, Anti-Banking Company. So it's not the Kirtland Safety Society Bank, it's the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. To solve this little problem of the notes already being printed with the Kirtland Safety Society Bank, Joe told Ollie to simply engrave anti in front of the bank and ing after bank and put company below it so the notes read Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company instead of just Kirtland Safety Society Bank. Fucking brilliant, if you ask me. So to describe what the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company was, I'm going to read the preamble and the Articles of Agreement set out to describe exactly what it was. There are 16 articles in total, and I'll describe what each article is as we read it. Now, my sincerest apologies if this part gets, a little bit dry because we're basically reading a legal document about the establishment of a company. And in any other case, this would be like reading an iTunes, like, terms and conditions agreement, but, like suicide worthy. But the language used and the kind of the trickery that Joe and Rigdon use in this word soup needs to be called out and discussed if we're to, really understand what the hell we're talking about here. So to help me parse out exactly what we're looking at, I'm bringing on a friend of the show with some proper expertise in starting a financial company and in, everything that we're discussing for this segment here. Phil Ferguson is the owner / director / CEO of Polaris Financial Planning and host of Skeptic Money Podcast, part of the Secular Media Network. And he's just pretty much an all-around badass when it comes to investing in financial planning. So welcome to the show, Phil.
Well, hey, thanks. I would have done better if you didn't raise expectations because now people fucking expect shit from me.
That's what we bring people onto this show, just to throw them off base and they don't know what the fuck is going to hit them.
That's right. And just one little note, the old show was called Skeptic Money. The new show is the Phil Ferguson Show.
Ah, there we go. Phil Ferguson Show. So that's, of course, there will be links to it in the show notes and it's on skepticmoney.com. So that's what threw me off there. But yes, Thank you for clarifying that. That's awesome. So Phil, are you ready to dive into the Articles of Agreement for the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company here?
I don't think I've ever been more excited to read a legal document.
That's actually really, I'm glad to hear that because, I've heard your show. I obviously came onto your show, for one episode where we talked about Mormon money and that was an absolute party. And, I listen to your segments when you go on to, Dogma Debate and, you have to go through stuff like this all the time, like legal documents talking about, a certain bullshit financial, plan that somebody is trying to sell somebody else. And, all in all, it seems like you're much more familiar with this shit than I am. And, that's kind of why I'm bringing you on here because I'm kind of confused at some of the terminology used here.
Well, I think you got a pretty good grip, but of course we'll tie in a few things that I might know with your history and culture of the church, and we'll make a party out of it. So I'm ready when you are, dude.
That's awesome. So what we're going to do is just read this straight out of the History of the Church, Volume 2, page 470 to 472. And I'm going to read the preamble here to it, and then we'll just switch off on reading the articles here, just to kind of familiarize the listeners with what we're reading exactly here. So the preamble starts out, The House was called to order, and object of the meeting explained by the chairman, which was first to annul the old Constitution, which was adopted by the Society on the 2nd day of November 1836, which we covered earlier in the show, which was, on motion by the unanimous vote of the meeting, annulled. Second, to adopt Articles of Agreement by which the Kirtland Safety Society is to be governed. After much discussion and investigation, the following preamble and articles of agreement were adopted by the unanimous voice of the meeting. We, the undersigned subscribers for the promotion of our temporal interests and for better management of our different occupations, which consist of agriculture, mechanical arts, and merchandising, do hereby form ourselves into a firm or company for the before mentioned objects by the name of the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. For the proper management of said firm, we individually and jointly enter into and adopt the following articles of agreement. So that's our preamble there. That's basically setting out establishing what they're doing, basically, right?
Yeah, it sounds pretty safe so far.
All right. So do you want to start us off with the first article here?
Sure. And my little disclaimer, I'm a talker, not a reader, but we'll see how this goes.
Perfect.
It's funny. It's Article First. Okay. Article 1. Article First. The capital stock of said company or firm shall not be less than $4 million to be divided into shares of $50 each and may be increased to any amount at the discretion of the managers.
So I have to say, like, right off the bat, to put some context into this, the church was in, about $40,000 to $50,000 of debt, which was, about, just barely over $1 million of today's money in debt, which is, that's a substantial amount of debt for a single church, right?
That's real money.
Yeah, that's real money. So, it's kind of ambitious that they were limiting their actual stock to $4 million, right? I mean, cause that's $108 million of today's money. So he was Joe was just a little bit, ambitious about the potential growth of the company, I think.
Well, I mean, go big or go home, dude.
I suppose so. I guess Joe wasn't one to go small.
You've created a whole fucking religion. How ambitious is it to make a bank?
Right? I mean, it was, at this point, one might argue that it was necessary more than ambitious. Like, they had to, it seems like they were doing this to solve the problem of their outstanding debts, which is, something we'll get into in some of the later articles here. But I do have to also point out, like, that $108 million of today's dollars, that they set out that it could be, the capital stock could go up to. That's like pocket change to the church today because they have assets, somewhere in like the $60 billion range. So yeah, $108 million. That's like a luncheon for the president of the church right now.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I also did a little research before our talk and found out this kind of, stock equity company, whatever we're going to call it here, was actually surprisingly common and led to a really big recession and even a depression.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the arguments that a lot of apologists use about this, because it's like, what we're talking about is pretty underhanded. The fact that they were establishing a church and printing their own money, in order to solve a huge debt crisis that they have, like, that's pretty underhanded at the onset. But the apologists say, well, lots of people were doing it at the time, so it didn't mean that it was wrong. No, you're still fucking over a lot of people and trying to absolve debt by creating a false economy. So
yeah, I just think he was no more wrong in this regard than any other fake bank that was created at the time. It looked like it was quite a popular thing to do.
Oh yeah, kind of weird. It's like the same kind of financial bubble that led to the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression in the '30s, right? This was kind of the same thing.
Sure looks like it when money just becomes created out of nowhere. That's fine until the party stops, and then it usually stops hard.
Right, kind of weird how that works. But I didn't also need to point out in that article there, it said, to be divided into shares of $50 each. So they were smart enough to divide it into, the company into shares. So it was actually like a publicly traded company. And, one of Joe's favorite things to do that he learned from his old papa, Big Daddy Cheese, Joseph Smith Sr., was speculation. So that was great for speculation. Just create a company that's divided up into shares that way.
Well, the one thing that I noticed that I didn't catch the first read through until I got near the end, it says, and may be increased to any amount I read that as they could sell more shares, or that maybe they would increase in value just because the underlying investment increases. But we'll find out later what that really means. I don't want to spoil it for the listeners.
Perfect. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, so I'm excited to learn as well. Let's get into this.
There you go.
All right, I'm going to read the second article here. It says, Article 2nd, the management of said company shall be under the superintendence of 32 managers, to be chosen annually by and from among the members of the same, each member being entitled to 1 vote for each share which he, she, or they may hold in said company, and said votes may be given by proxy or in propria persona. So,
I like that propria persona. That's sexy.
Right? You gotta use the Latin words, but isn't that just meaning like they can be there to represent themselves, kind of?
Well, I think the intent is that anyone who owns the shares at $50 a piece, each share gets 1 vote, and collectively they all could meet and vote who are going to be the 32.
Okay. Yeah, and then they're voted on apparently annually as well. I think it's just designated every other November. They choose from it says, from among the members of the same. So they choose from among the members, the 32 managers, who's going to be like the leaders, I think. That's right, kind of how I read it.
But you could have literally tens of thousands of members because they only pay $50 each, and collectively they've got $4 million. But like many businesses, a lot of the value is going to be owned by a handful of people. So the people who buy the most shares get the most votes, and that all seems perfectly cromulent so far.
Yeah. Of course, we can't really ignore the fact that we're talking about a church that's establishing a bank here.
Right.
Sorry, it's not a bank. It's not a bank. I have to say it's an anti-banking company. That's very semantically detailed there. But, we can't ignore how wrong that seems at this point, but, we'll kind of discuss that later on at the closing of the reading the articles here, because Joseph encapsulates it perfectly when he announces it in the Messenger and Advocate. But that's later. We'll get to that very soon here.
You want me to do 3?
Yeah. You want to do 3rd?
Yeah, let me try that here. Article 3rd. It shall be the duty of said managers, when chosen, to elect from their number a treasurer and secretary. It shall be the further duty of said managers to meet in the upper room of the office of said company on the first Mondays of November and May of each year at 9:00 a.m. to inspect the books of said company and transact such business as may be deemed necessary. End quote.
And there's not really any explanation necessary. That's pretty standard practice, just setting out, biannual meetings, right?
Yep. Just a note that we're going to have a meeting. I did find it was funny that they have the upper room. I'm sure that's a biblical reference. And the 9:00, it has to be at 9:00. So that was really important. You have to put that in the bylaws.
Mm-hmm. Of course, yes. Not 8:30, not 9:01. No, 9:00 a.m. There we go. Very, very particular here.
Very precise. I like that.
Yeah, right? Especially when we're talking about the founding, document of a company like this. If they're smart enough to have this much foresight to set out the times for the meetings, like that's good management right there.
What could go wrong?
Right. I'm going to read the 4th article here. It shall be the duty of said managers to choose from among their number 7 men who shall meet in the upper room of said office on Tuesday of each week at 3:00 p.m. to inquire into and assist in all matters pertaining to said company. So once again, right. No real explanation necessary, just setting out, we're going to have weekly meetings and then biannual meetings, and it's going to be in this place at this time. So, no changes there.
It's starting to sound like all men are equal, but some are more equal.
Right, exactly. But the next article starts to get a little bit more interesting. You want to dive into that one?
Sure. Article 5th. Each manager shall receive from the company $1 per day for his services when called together at the annual and semi-annual meetings. The treasurer and secretary and the seven the committee of the managers. Okay. Wow. It's like the Lord of the Rings here.
Yeah, that shall was
shall receive a compensation for their services as shall be agreed by the managers at their semi-annual meeting. So the 32 get $1, but the 7 could get something dramatically more.
Right. And it says, basically they can be compensated without limit, for their services, and the rate that they're compensated is agreed upon by the committee of the 32 managers. I have to say it sounds like pretty standard business practice as far as like a board of directors goes, right?
Yeah, there's nothing weird here. And just like in modern days, the board of directors can often decide what their compensation is, if any, and they can often decide the top level management. And sometimes they get nutty and pay people a shitload of money, even if they have no value.
Weird. I wonder if that's what we're getting into right here. But one thing I did want to point out is like, those 7, primary directors that are taken from the 32 managers, those are like also the president of the church and, like the upper echelons of the ecclesiastical authority. So they can like call you under ecclesiastical punishment if for some reason you don't agree with them or they don't agree with you. So that can become a problem, right? So if the upper echelon, if these 7 say, hey, we're going to vote on a dividend raise or, our compensation, we're going to increase it by $1 per week or $2 per week. And if you're a member of the 32 managers below them, you're like, I don't agree with that. They can call you in under ecclesiastical punishment and say, well, you're going against the authorities of the church and you're excommunicated. And then you're just out. You're gone. That's it. You're fucked.
Yeah, it adds an extra layer of concern. But of course that can happen in any board. There's always politics involved. But if I may paraphrase, from a recent episode of Game of Thrones that I've been watching, when faith is involved, reason is lost.
Oh, beautiful. So beautiful. Whether it's faith in a church or in a leader of a church or faith in a false company like this that's being created out of thin air, right?
Yeah, it's getting interesting, but it's going to get even better.
Oh, right. Let's see. So you read the last one. I'll read the next one here. Article 6th. The first election of managers, as set forth in the second article, shall take place at the meeting of the members to adopt this agreement, who shall hold their offices until the first Monday of November 1837, unless removed by death or misdemeanor, or until others are duly elected. Every annual election of managers shall take place on the first Monday of November in each year. It shall be the duty of the treasurer and secretary, those are 2 important positions, of said company to receive the votes of the members by ballot and declare the election.
Yeah, sounds pretty fair. So this is happening in November of 36, and a year later, in November of 37, they'll do over.
Yes, that sounds about right. But yeah. I do have to say that, unless those people are removed by death or misdemeanor, and when the ecclesiastical authority of the church is also the government of Kirtland, they could bring up a misdemeanor against somebody for pretty much any reason, even if they considered it, unchristian-like conduct with women, like in the case of Sylvester Smith and Dr. Phalasis Hurlbutt, and, those are other people in the timeline that you probably don't know about, Phil. But it goes back to the point that I made after the last article. It's like, if somebody got mad at them, for whatever reason, maybe they had some sort of disagreement, they could call them under a court or the church system, charge them with a misdemeanor, and boom, they're removed. Like you said, it's politics. It's bullshit.
It's interesting. I've had debates with many Christians, not so many Mormons, but many Christians. And if they seem to be really serious, I'll often ask them a question that says something like, would you want the church that you belong to be in charge of the government and run every aspect of your life? And the vast majority of people say no.
No, right.
And because they're like, well, no, God, it's just that I don't want that everywhere all the time. And I said, why are you still a member? And it creates this cognitive dissonance for them. The ones that really scare me is the ones that say yes.
Right. Because it's like, well, why don't you convert to Islam and go live in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or, any of those other wonderful countries that are basically a theocratic dictatorship? Because they're working so well.
Yeah, you could go to the country of Utah.
Touche. Exactly. Same exact thing. When the authorities, the civil servants are so deeply intertwined in the religion, there's really no separating out the religious law from the actual bylaws of the country or the city state or whatever you want to call any given territory that's basically run by a church. And it only takes looking at Utah today, or especially looking into the history of Utah, the 1850s, 60s, and 70s when it was run by Brigham Young, to understand what it was like to have a theocracy in the borders of the, American territory.
Right.
It's amazing stuff.
Are you ready for 7?
Absolutely.
Article 7. The books of the company shall be always open for the inspection of the members. Well, that sounds pretty generous.
Doesn't it, though? But my note on this, I read through this and I made little notes, and of course I sent them to you, but my note is like, it's like nonprofit organizations have open books today. But, if you just try to look at the church's books right now, just, see how far you get before like 6 guys with briefcases and court summons show up at your door. Like, they're not open. And I can't imagine that this company was any more open than the church is today with their books.
Right. And in the United States, the average nonprofit, a 501c3, has to fill out documents every year that detail where the revenue comes from and where it goes and who gets paid. And it's a great fun read if you're ever thinking of giving to a charity. However,
unless you're religious.
That's right. If you claim that you're religious, you are removed from the responsibility of filing any of that information.
A delightful violation of the First Amendment, isn't it?
I think so. When you're talking about if the rules apply equally to everyone, if you want charity status, you should follow the same rules that everyone else follows. I take a weird line. I guess I would be all for taxing the churches, but I think if they just have to comply with the same regulations that every other 501c3 charity does, I would be fine.
I would, I almost disagree with that because,
I thought you might.
Yeah, well, only because when you have a church like the Mormon Church, right, that has their nonprofit side, which is the Church of Jesus Christ, but then it's all incorporated under, the corporation of the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's the official title of the LDS Church. They're able to designate any income that comes in from this nonprofit side and say, this is basically our fund. This is our shadow money that nobody gets to look at. Nobody gets to play with. We don't have to file any of the same regulations as any other 501c3 non-religious nonprofit has to file. And then it's like, it seems like they can easily intermingle that money into their corporate assets as well. And there's, really no way of verifying whether or not they actually keep the profit side and the nonprofit side separate. So I say, if you're a church, you're selling a product, whether that product is, pillows like a normal company, or you're selling, like a church does, an invisible product, you're selling people's eternity. You're still selling a product. You should be subject to the same exact laws as any other company is, any other taxable company.
Well, I don't know if you know this, but, since one of the big things of my show is talking about investment scams and rip-offs and how the markets work. One of the analogies I love to make, and I think some of your listeners were like this, that investment products are a lot like religion. They scare you, they provide you the solution, and they take your money. It's really the same overriding thing. Like, for example, long-term, care insurance. If you go in a nursing home, they scare you that after 50 years of savings, you might spend all your money in the last couple of years. Then they come up with a solution, long-term care insurance, and then they sell it to you and they take your money and you get almost nothing out of it. So it's very much like religion.
Oh man, that's beautiful. And that is one main reason why people should go to your show, is the amazing analogies that can be created in the twisted world of financial schemes like that, and in the twisted world of church schemes that you analyze with just as the same level of scrutiny.
And of course, both are totally legal.
Weird. That's fucking wrong.
Under current law, the people who have the money and the power affect the rules. So the banks get to have input on what rules will regulate them, just like churches apparently have.
Right. And if anybody does try to change it, they still have a multi-billion-dollar lobbying force that stops any legislation going through that tries to curtail these any of what you're talking about, whether it's financial fucking over or afterlife fucking over by a church.
There you go.
It's not going to pass.
Well, the nice thing that the church has is that, if you die and you don't actually get your own planet, how are you going to bitch about it?
Right. Yeah, one planet, one vote.
That's right. That's right. They got the ultimate escape clause. I mean, at least with the investment world, if you get ripped off, you can hopefully you're still alive and you get to bitch about it. But if you find out the church is all a lie upon your death, well, oops.
Right. Well, and I have a relative that doesn't go to church at all, doesn't spend any time going to church. You might call him a Jack Mormon because she smokes, drinks, whatever, that's no big deal. Drinks coffee, oh God. But she still pays her tithing. Every year she writes a huge check to the church and says, this is my fire insurance. Because there's, laws written in the Book of Mormon or in the Bible or whatever that those who contribute or, those who believe in me or whatever won't be burned at the last day. I think that's the Book of Mormon. So she just pays her tithing every year, an annual tithing settlement. So she's getting none of the benefits of like the community of church and actually participating, but she's, being screwed over with all of the most negative parts of it, of the church just stealing her money and fucking off with it. So,
well, that shows you the power of fear. So
right.
if you meet with somebody that's selling you anything, and one of the topics of discussion is what you're afraid of, you should be extra concerned that you're now being manipulated.
Right. Exactly. If they have to use fear as part of their sales tactic, if the product doesn't sell itself and they have to incite fear in order to sell it, that should make you very skeptical of what they're trying to sell.
Well, and it's also like with the church, and I see the same thing in investments. With the church, you have to get this right before you die. So there's a time limit. Often with investments, they'll tell you, if you don't get this today, that kind of thing, or this might not be available next week. You've got to decide right now. So you create a sense of urgency. So you create fear and urgency. It's a wonderful, powerful sales tool.
Oh, it's miraculous not miraculous, it's serendipitous how it delightfully intertwined they are, right? Whether it's a church or, a financial company that's trying to scheme people. It's just like a different label for the same exact product, except the fact that the church sells something that is never verifiable, right? Like you
absolutely.
said, there's recourse if you get screwed over by a financial company, but if you die and find out that the church sold you a false eternity, there's not really any recourse for that. You'll just burn into Muslim hell forever, right?
There you go. All right. I'm ready for 8 if you are.
Absolutely. Let's see. Is that one mine? Let's see. No, I'm reading evens, right?
Yep.
All right. It shall be the duty of the managers of the company to declare a dividend once in 6 months, which dividend shall be apportioned among the members according to the installments by them paid in. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, it seems pretty straightforward.
Right. But I have to say, this is kind of where it gets a little more nefarious in my opinion, right? Because like a company should live or die by the board of directors and the investors in that company, or the people that pay installments, right? So if the company does well, the people at the top that invest in the company should do well as well, right? It should pay out positive dividends.
Sure.
But if the company fails, then the people at the top should, they shouldn't be the ones that lose their asses, right?
Well, maybe a little conflict here. The people at the top, they are theoretically paid for management skills. But when a company goes bankrupt, the largest owners should lose money, and they don't have to necessarily be the people at the top. Although in this case, they probably are the same people.
Yeah. It's all of the member of the 32 managers that it set out at the beginning.
Right. Assuming they at some point bought a good chunk of the company.
Right. But the problem with the company that we're talking about here, this Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company, is they didn't have any assets to pay dividends on. All they had were liabilities. They just had tons of debt and $200,000 of money that was worth, like less than the paper that it was actually printed on. They
one
didn't
would
have
imagine
assets
that
to divide.
If they sold $4 million worth of shares, they should have $4 million.
You see this paper bag? You want to buy what's in this paper bag? I'm not going to tell you what it is or tell you how much it's worth. How much do you think it's worth, right? Same kind of thing.
Yep. I mean, there's no creation of value within the company, but at least, as soon as they sold all the initial shares, assuming they sold all of them, they should have $4 million in cash sitting there. Now, the question, of course, how would there be dividends? What have you done with the money? I mean, 6 months later to actually have turned a profit or brought in more money from conducting your business, however that happens, would be very hard, but they should have plenty of money, but I guess we're going to find out what happened to all that money, right?
Right. Well, the thing is like they were just printing the money, right? They weren't using like actual government tender. They were, like you said at the beginning, it was kind of frequent for companies to just start printing their own money in the 1830s, and it created this false economy. They
would print their own notes that they would guarantee. But when you bought shares of the company always took U.S. currency to sell you shares of ownership.
Right. But that implies that the company is establishing itself with assets, right? And the people are actually buying into assets. But this company
not necessarily. Assets. I mean, if you think a company has a good patent or a good idea, you could throw money at it because that idea in the future will generate money. And so like when Facebook launched and sold all of its shares, let's just say they sold for $1 billion of shares. The day they sell all those shares, they actually have $1 billion in cash.
Okay.
Even if the company from that point forward never makes another penny, they get all the money from the shares that they sold. And it's just like, with, these, pseudo currencies that are out, I can't remember what one of them, they get these online things, Bitcoin.
Like Starbucks bucks or Bitcoin or whatever.
Yeah, like Bitcoin. The fun thing I like to do with someone that is a big fan of Bitcoin, I say, what's a Bitcoin worth? And they'll tell me a number, $112. And I go, there you go. That's all you needed to know. It's $112. It's not a Bitcoin. Bitcoin has no value in and of itself. It's only in relationship to something else that you consider that has value. In this case, US dollars. But when the company launched, when this, joint stock company launched and they sold these $50 shares, people genuinely really gave Joseph Smith $50 in cash. He didn't take fake money from them. He took real money. But when someone borrowed from this joint stock company, they would give them a note. Or if the company wanted to get money from somebody else other than a shareholder, they could issue notes that would be printing money that is fake money and could be worth zero, but the company would always bring in real U.S. currency. That's why these things were so common back then, because it was a way to raise a whole lot of real money. And you could then hand out your fake money and say it's worth real money, but why not just use real money? Because the real money is valuable. The fake money may or may not be valuable. So once they issued all the shares, assuming they sold $4 million worth of $50 shares, they should have $4 million of cash. Where does that $4 million go?
I guess that does make sense when you lay it out like that, but I don't understand, I guess, where the $4 million came into play. They just set that out as like the limit of what the company would be worth, right? They said, that was the first thing. They said the capital stock of said company or firm shall not be less than $4 million. They never collected $4 million from the members of the church. That just seems like an arbitrary amount that they were just like, yeah, we think this company is worth $4 million. Here's a share for you and a share for you. And, it's right. divided up into these $50 shares.
That's totally arbitrary until I get people to actually invest $4 million. Now, I didn't read in my research how much money they brought in. So if they said it's going to be worth $4 million and they sell $50 a share and they only bring in $1 million in cash, well, then $4 million does become bullshit. It'd be, okay, I just declare that it's worth $4 million. Well, what the fuck does that mean? If you only brought in $1 million, you only have $1 million. And that's why something like this is like, what is it you're buying into? And I also learned that there was no limit. So in the number of shares they could sell. So like in the U.S. stock market, and I'll go back to Facebook because I mentioned that before. Mm-hmm. When it went public, there was a certain number of shares that they could sell. And once those are all sold, they're all sold. One of the most dangerous things you can do as an investor is buy stock in a company that has what's called an open issue. They can always create more shares. So,
that makes sense. So then if they just continue to make more and more shares, then of course the shares lose value and you're losing money on your investment of the shares that you own.
And there's a lot of investments like that still today. And there's all kinds of different federal carve-outs and law. One of them is non-traded REITs, real estate investment trusts. You can do that. Another one is master limited partnerships. They can keep selling shares as long as there's suckers to buy the shares. And every time they sell a share, the value of the company, in theory at least, goes up by an amount equal to the new money coming in. However, if the company is not doing well or losing money, it can cover the fact that the company is shrinking in value by continually bringing in new money from the outside by selling shares.
By selling more and more shares.
Right. But at some point, if some of the investors, 2, 3, 5% of the investors become spooked and say, hey, wait a minute, this thing may not actually be worth what we originally put in. I want my money back. If no one can then cover that, the stock price can fall precipitously because, like you said, there's nothing other than the cash to show there's value. And if the cash is gone, there is no value. So if this joint stock company raised $1 million, let's say, and that money was squandered, well, what are your shares worth? Nothing.
So I guess that's the best part of it is like they limited it, or they said that, initial investment cost of it, or the initial capital is $4 million, just pulling that number out of their ass, right? But then, it can be increased to any amount after that. I assume that was probably fairly common in many other companies that were starting up the same thing back in the 1830s, just like Joe and Rigdon were doing right here, right? They could just, as a solution to a ever shrinking company, they can just manufacture more shares, still selling them at $50 a share instead of, lowering the share price, down to 25 or down to $10 or whatever.
And that's why, and so what this is, when you said before this was not publicly traded, I would say it's privately traded. It's traded in between people. It's not listed on an exchange. So when you buy, and I'll just, to be consistent with Facebook, it's publicly traded and it's listed on an exchange. So you can check and see the price any minute of any day that the markets are opened. And you can have a pretty good idea exactly what you're going to get. And you're going to get it, at least now in the modern world, in seconds. You're going to get that amount of money minus a small transaction fee to make the trade. But something that's privately traded, it really comes down to two people agreeing on the price. Who knows what the right price is? One argument is the right price is what the two people agree to.
Right. And if it's like this company we're talking about here with the Kirtland Safety Society, it was just, privately traded among members of the church, however, I think they were around maybe 10,000 people at this time, probably less than that. And, probably only a small percentage of those, those 10 or so thousand people actually bought in any shares or any stock into this company. So it was just whatever any of them decided was what the shares were worth, that, that's what they were buying and selling them for. So it was like, Kirtland and Missouri, wherever the Mormons were, they were like Joe and Rigdon's own little guinea pig market that they were playing with.
That's right. Because if your bank is your church and you have confidence in your church, how can you not have confidence in your bank? You buy if you buy you buy a $50 share of the bank, it's worth $50. It can never be worth less. It must be worth more as time goes on. It creates a situation where you can never get a proper valuation, even if theoretically the books are open.
You know what this is making me really want, this whole discussion?
To start a company?
No, well, a little bit, but no, I want the actual, the corporation of the church, the LDS church, to be publicly traded. How great would that be? Actually trading shares of the LDS church back and forth. And then, we can actually open up their books and see what their assets really are.
Well, and that's the thing, is that theoretically in the United States, you're either a for-profit, and then you have to have certain reports to the government, or you're a non-for-profit, and you still have to have certain disclosure documents that show where the money comes from and goes to. And that applies to every business, whether it's publicly traded, privately traded, for-profit or non-profit. unless you say you're a religion, and then all that shit goes out. Well, there's other carve-outs too, but when you say you're a religion, none of that matters, and you can do anything you want to, and you can collect any amount of money. The very idea that the church wasn't collecting enough unfiltered money and that they had to go start a joint stock company is hysterical to me, because it's like one perfectly glorious tax-free scheme is not enough.
Yeah, they had to manufacture another one to even stay somewhat solvent.
I have to come up with another way to, because all the suckers following me giving me 10% is not enough money. Well, how is that possible?
Right? Exactly. Oh, and I think exactly to your point, Article 9 really, I think is going to open up this discussion even more. So you want to get onto that one?
Yeah. Article 9th, that cracks me up. All persons subscribing stock in said firm shall pay their first installment at the time of subscribing, and other installments from time to time as shall be required by the managers.
And so that's great.
So what I read that to mean, that this is deeply insidious, is that if I say that your share is worth $50, and then later I say your share is worth $60, I don't give you 60 back in lieu of the 50 that you gave me to buy in. I go to you and tell you that you owe me another $10. Are you fucking kidding me?
No, this is not only insidious, but fucking brilliant. That's what this
is. And it's like, I go to you, Bryce, and I say, you owe me $50. And you go, what the fuck for? And I go, just cause. And you go, okay. And so you give me $50, and I promise at some point in the future, you'll get your $50 back. But along the way, I come back and I go, you now owe me $70 and you've only given me 50. Give me 20 more. And you go, okay.
Well, and that's the thing, is like, from time to time, as shall be required by the managers. They could do it at any time. They could just walk up to somebody and say, hey, we need this X amount of dollars in order to keep your installments active and to keep you as an active investor. And if not, then your shares go into delinquency and will be sold off, right?
I guess I don't know that do we get into specifically what happens to your ownership if you don't cough up more? I mean, that's great.
Well, in this next one, actually, the next article, let's bring that one in because it kind of wraps into this discussion as well. So I'll read that. Article 10th. The managers shall give 30 days notice in some public paper printed in this county previous to an installment being paid in. All subscribers residing out of the state shall be required to pay in half the amount of their subscription at the time of subscribing, and the remainder, or such part thereof, as shall be required at any time by the managers after 30 days notice. So at least they did, create some sort of protection for the people that are subscribing. They said, we'll give you 30 days notice if we're going to, if we're going to call for, more installments, in order to, keep your subscription active into the company.
And this is in 1836. So every single person that has bought in via $50, if they raise it to $72, has to cough up $22 more, and they sure as fuck better doing it within 30 days. How is that communicated? I mean, I get sure that it went in a paper, but I'm in a different state. Whoop-de-doo-de-doo. I'm in a different state. How do I know? The only way they can possibly expect that to be the case, first of all, they're expecting the vast majority of the money to come locally. And secondly, it has to be within a system where they can have a reasonable expectation they can communicate with all the investors, i.e. members of congregations.
Right. Well, and I get the idea that a lot of the people that were subscribing to the company were also subscribers to the newspaper that was active at the time, which was called the Messenger and Advocate. That's actually where this was printed. It originally was in the Messenger and Advocate. So anybody that was receiving that paper would be receiving the notice that the installments are increasing. Like, hey, you owe us $20 this month or whatever. But those people were already subscribing to the newspaper, which was a requirement of like $1 per month or something like that already. And actually printing the newspaper didn't cost that much money. So they were already part of a pyramid scheme, and they were just like, let's just tack a bigger pyramid scheme onto this already pyramid scheme. Let's try and expand this thing and get it as big as we possibly can.
It's brilliant in a way.
Right? And really kind of fucked up too.
Well, it's funny because most shows I cover some bad thing in the investment world, and some of them are really elaborate and really, dare I say it, clever. And I can really appreciate the thought that's gone into one of these things. I still think that they're insidious and possibly even evil. Legal, sure, but immoral, yeah. But I can still appreciate the art form that it is that someone can create something that basically takes your money and has virtually no chance of ever giving any of it back to you, and you're happy about it. That's brilliant.
Right.
Absolutely
right,
brilliant.
and it makes you feel like you own a piece of something that's, really big or something that's really important, right? Especially when it's so deeply intertwined with the church here, right? And this was a company that was made by the church for the benefit of the church to answer the church's debts for building the temple and for the people that were living in Missouri at this time that were basically squatting on their land because the church was defaulting on the money that it had taken out to buy the people's land that would be living in Missouri. So it's like,
I think
they're squeezing blood from a stone at this point.
Yeah, this makes a great birthday gift. I think you buy a $50 share and you give one to each of your wives. It's perfect.
Right. It's a gift that just keeps on taking.
That's right. And no itching. I can go to 11 if you're ready.
Yeah, go ahead.
Article 11th. The treasurer shall be empowered to call special meetings of the managers whenever he of course, shall deem it necessary, separate and aside from the annual and semi-annual meetings. Okay. That seems pretty harmless.
Right. I don't think there's really any explanation necessary for that one. It's just like, if we need a meeting, we're going to call a special meeting. No big deal, right?
Yep. Piece of cake.
Cool. I'm going to move on to the 12th here. 2/3 of the managers shall form a quorum to act at the semi-annual meetings at any number of the 7. The committee of the managers, with the treasurer and secretary, or either of them, may form a quorum to transact business at the weekly meetings, and in case none of the 7 is present at the weekly meetings, the treasurer and secretary must transact business. Oh, I just caught on to something.
Yeah, so this has two important parts, and see if I'm going to cover what you were thinking. That if you have the semi-annual or annual meeting in previous context, here they just call it the 2 semi-annual meetings, which is an awkward change of formatting. You have to have quorum of the 32 by 2/3 of the people. Okay, pretty standard stuff. However, the weekly meetings that have the 7, you only have to have one of them with either the treasurer or the secretary. Or if none of the 7 show up except for the secretary and treasurer, the 2 of them can decide anything they want with a quorum of 2.
And they can call a special meeting at any time. So they can say, hey, we're sitting down for a couple of brews. Let's call this a special meeting. And whatever we decide is basically decreed as part of business transactions.
Absolutely. I love this. So whoever whoever the secretary and treasurer are, they pretty much have pretty wide free range control of this institution.
Do you want to know who those people were?
I got to guess, but why don't you tell me?
Joseph Smith was the treasurer, and can you guess who the secretary was?
Oh, God. Oh, hang on. I was just looking at this guy's name. Hang on. Rigdon?
Yes, indeed. Sidney Rigdon.
Yeah, I'm partly psychic. I could tell.
They could just meet up at any time and say, oh, we're calling a special meeting right now. Be there in 2 minutes. And then whatever transactions they made, that was all covered as, 2/3 majority and agreed upon by the quorum of the 32 people because none of them were present.
There you go.
Fucking brilliant, dude. Like you said, it's like a form of art. I'm coming to respect what they did here just because, even if it is insidious and nefarious and, really sinister, it's like they still had to understand what they were doing in order to do this.
Well, you don't write a 1,000-page book as a moron.
No.
You've got to be pretty fucking smart to, stick your face into a hat and come up with these long and detailed stories. It's impressive.
No doubt about that. Absolutely. So now, okay. So when I first read through the 11th and 12th articles, I didn't understand how nefarious that actually is, but now it makes a lot more sense.
Do people still follow this old religion?
It might surprise you to understand that it's grown since this time.
Well, I guess I'm not too surprised. I had to grow because it was pretty damn small then. I'm surprised they survived this thing, but They survived a lot of bad things. So, I mean, that's a sign of divine providence right there.
Oh, isn't it though? Like, it must be divinely inspired if they were able to survive so much persecution and, the creation of a false economy that collapsed a year and a half later. And, it must have been divine, right?
Yeah. Are you ready for 13?
Yeah, fire away.
Article 13th. At least they didn't skip 13, like hotels do.
Right.
I'm loving being in an elevator and someone pushes 14th and I go, you're on the 13th floor? And they go, no, I'm on the 14th. And I go, dude, you can call it whatever you want. It's still the 13th
It's still
floor.
the 13th. Come on, dude.
Yeah. Article 13th. The managers shall have power to enact such bylaws as they may deem necessary from time to time, provided they do not infringe upon these articles of agreement.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the more sinister and fucked up out of all of these articles, right? So, like, basically, if something doesn't work out, or if one of the laws or rules that they set out, one of these articles gets in the way, they can just change it to suit their own best interests. And then,
they do have a limit. They can't infringe upon these first articles.
Right, but if you look at like the 11th and 12th article that we talked about, just a second ago, they could, just Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith could call together one of these special meetings and just say, hey, let's create a new rule because, something isn't right. Does it infringe on any of these other articles? I don't think it does. Do you think it does? No, I don't think it does. No, okay, we're good.
Well, if I'm reading this correctly, and it may all be moot, the word managers here, and previously, managers refers to the 32.
Mm-hmm.
The 7, or the committee of the managers, is the 7. So, this would still need a quorum of the 32 to change the bylaws.
But those 7 were taken from the 32 managers.
They were, and they're given day-to-day operational responsibilities, which the 2 could do pretty much anything, but it doesn't anywhere say that they have the power to change the bylaws. That is explicitly defined here as the managers shall have the power, not the committee of 7.
But I see it as like the committee of the 7 were still managers, and then if we look back at
they are 7 of the managers that are given a subset of responsibilities, but it's tricksy and the words are funky. But everywhere else where it said just managers, that's the 32. When you get to the 7, it's the 7 or the committee of managers.
The committee of managers. Okay.
Since it doesn't say the committee of managers, if it said the committee managers or the 7 may or shall have the power to, it says the managers, that means the 32. That's how I'm reading it, but who knows?
Okay, that's fair. But I would almost look back at the 12th article there where it says, 2/3 of the managers shall form a quorum to act at the semi-annual meetings. And then if any number of the 7, or, any of them are not, in any case, none of the 7 is present at the weekly meetings, the treasurer and secretary may transact the business. So I'm seeing it as like, basically, they set out this, the managers can change these bylaws if necessary, or they can enact new bylaws as long as they don't infringe on other articles. But basically, any number of the managers that are present at any time that are called to one of these special meetings or whatever it may be could still conduct this business as they saw fit.
Well, and I think that may be, and of course it could have changed in 150 years what words mean, but conducting the business is the day-to-day operations. That's what the 7 does. And the big group, the 32, they do board stuff.
Okay.
It's very common within an organization to have a board and then a smaller set, not necessarily 7, but that's not an unreasonable number, to do day-to-day stuff so all 32 people aren't bogged down doing all of the work. You've ever been in a boardroom with 32 people?
No, I've never been in a boardroom, but it sounds like hell.
Yeah, because everybody wants to have their say, and it takes forever to get anything done.
Right, of course.
Humans can be like that.
Yeah, so that makes a fair amount of sense. So maybe that isn't quite as sinister as I thought it was originally, but still, given the previous articles that we read, I don't think that I was completely out on a limb thinking that it was like, oh, well, Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith could just say whatever they wanted to and enact any bylaw and as they saw fit, basically. So,
well, no, the whole funny thing is that none of this lasted long enough for that to fucking matter.
Right. So well said. All right, I'm going to read the 14th here. Article 14th, all notes given by said society shall be signed by the treasurer and secretary thereof, and we, the individual members of said firm, hereby hold ourselves bound for the redemption of all such notes.
Wow.
So, yeah, I found that one to be very, very interesting, but I also saw it as like necessary in order to legally establish this as a company, right? If they're actually, paying out notes that are their own proprietary banknotes or anti-banking society notes, as you might call it, they still had to say that we're going to pay back the money that comes, that we're paid into, right?
Yeah. So this is the part where, the real money comes in as equity, as ownership and shares of the joint stock company. But then once the joint stock company is formed and it's got the pile of real cash, they can then issue notes, or loans to somebody and they're going to make that good, or they can borrow money from somebody and issue them a note. And so they can go to somebody and say, lend me $3,000 and I'm going to give you a note that says we owe you $3,000. That's what they're saying. They will pay that back. They're going to be bound for the redemption of those notes. So if the organization, borrows money from somebody, they have to pay it back. In 15, 20 minutes, I got to go back to work. As much fun as this is, I'm ready for, I think, are we on 15 now?
15. Yep. It's your read now.
Oh, I get a long one here. Okay. Article 15th. The notes given for the benefit of said society shall be given to the treasurer in the following form. 90 days after date, we jointly and separately, it should be severally, promise to pay A, B, or orders, dollars, and cents value it received. Wow. That's tricky. A record of which shall be made in the books at the time of the amount and by whom given and when due and deposited with the files and papers of said society. End quote. Wow.
So the way that I interpret that, and that's only from my, non-financial advisor, ignorant perspective, it was like, that's basically just like a record keeping clause, right? Like if we're, for every note that's issued, 90 days after it, we're going to pay it back. So once you give us money and we, buy your investment back, we're going to pay you back within 90 days. Is that correct?
Yep. Pretty straightforward. It's weird to read it out loud, but I think that's good. I think I don't see any real problems with that.
Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the 16th, and this is possibly, we'll discuss it. Article 16th. Any article in this agreement may be altered at any time, annulled, added to, or expunged by the vote of 2/3 of the members of said society, except the 14th article that shall remain unaltered during the existence of said company. So basically, Article 14th, that was the one that we discussed where they are bound to pay back no matter what, basically, right? So they can't change that, but every other article that we've discussed here, if 2/3 of the members of the society vote, they can change the article.
Yeah, and here's another thing that, often you can make arguments about one article from the context provided in another article, and this is talking about anything can change in the articles, but only if it's 2/3 of the members, which kind of goes to support the argument I made before, about how you change things. It's not the 2 people. It's not the 7. It's 2/3 of the 32. But,
well, and that's not even the managers. It says 2/3 of the members. So I read that as like everybody that owns shares in the company.
Oh, you're right.
It did say earlier that basically your share, one share makes a vote. Whoever
2/3 of the members of subsociety.
So if you have, one person that owns half of the shares of the company, or, you have 2 people that own 2/3 of the shares of the company, that makes up for 2/3 of the membership because one vote one share equals 1 vote in it.
I'm with you.
That's fucked up. That was probably the most fucked up one of it because, I understand, like, you need to put this clause in there, right? Because things things change over time, right?
That's right.
You're not going to understand the circumstances ahead of time when you're establishing a company like this. So a clause like this is necessary in Articles of Agreement. But saying that whoever has 2/3 of the vote, which is, the people that own the most shares, basically, they get to set the rules. They get to annul any of the agreements we just read, except for the 14th. They get to add them. They get to take away. They get to expunge them. Like, any of them can be altered just if 2/3 of the shareholders or whoever owns 2/3 of the shares wants it to be changed.
And that's one thing to have bylaws that can change in a charity or something. But for a company that's going to be worth $4 million, or as you said, in today's dollars, $108 million, it's a big deal to just willy-nilly change it like that.
Right? Well, and investors are probably, might see a clause like that and be like, wait, so if I don't own, if I'm not a member of the 2/3, if I don't own enough shares to be, a voice in this, then my voice doesn't really matter.
Right.
So I can see that might create some, fickle investors that might, get a little bit scared or spooked, like you said.
All with it.
It's amazing. So yeah, that's pretty much, there's a little bit more to the 16th article here. It says, for the true and faithful fulfillment of the above covenant and agreement, we individually bind ourselves to each other under the penal sum of $100,000. In witness thereof, we have hereunto set our hands and seals the day and date first above written. So that's, basically closing it all up and establishing it as, the articles of the company.
And who is responsible for this 100? Where does that come from?
I don't know.
Okay.
I think it's just whoever violates any of these laws is responsible for a penal sum of $100,000.
Yeah,
which is a shitload of money back then.
Oh my God!
Like, so much money. But I mean, they were divvying out $4 million worth of shares, so $100K. What's that? I mean, it's all monopoly money anyway. Who gives a fuck, right?
Right.
Amazing. All right, so, that was kind of the establishment of this company, and of course they had to announce the establishment of it in the Messenger and Advocate, which, as I said earlier, was the church's newspaper. So, I'm going to read through this, kind of burn through it really quickly, but we can discuss some of the finer points of it as we get into it here. It says, in connection with the above articles of agreement, the Kirtland Safety Society, I publish the following remarks to all who are preparing themselves and appointing their wise men for the purpose of building up Zion and her stakes in the January number of the Messenger and Advocate. So this is when they were announcing it, January of 1837. This is when they let everybody know about this. And this is how they announced it. It is wisdom and according to the mind of the Holy Spirit. So there it's invoking ecclesiastical authority here.
That's right.
That it's kind of messed up, but they don't stop there. That you should call at Kirtland and receive counsel and instruction upon those principles that are necessary to further the great work of the Lord and to establish the children of the kingdom according to the oracles of God. So basically, you have to do this. You have to abide by with this company that we're establishing because this is the mind of God. It's His work, and this is according to the oracles of God. Amazing. As they are had among us, and further we invite the brethren from abroad to call on us and take stock in our safety society. And we would remind them that also of the sayings of Isaiah contained in the 60th chapter, and more particularly in the 9th and 17th verses, which are as follows. Do you want to read those verses out of Isaiah there?
Sure. Phil? It says, surely the isles shall wait for me. I mean, like islands?
I think so, yeah.
Surely the isles shall wait for me, and the ships of That's why you have me read this. Tarshish first.
Sure.
To bring my sons from afar, their silver and their gold, not their banknotes. Oh, that I think, is that you editing?
No, that's actually put in the periodical here. They said not their banknotes. They inserted that.
Oh my God. With them unto the name of the Lord thy God and the Holy One of Israel, because he hath glorified thee.
Amazing, right? Keep reading, because it goes more out of Isaiah here.
For brass I will bring gold, and for iron I will bring silver, and for wood, brass, and for stone, iron, I will also make thy officers peace, and thy exactors' righteousness. Also, 62nd chapter, first verse, for Zion's sake will I hold my peace, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest until the righteousness thereof go forth as brightness, and the salvation thereof as a lamp that burneth.
Beautiful, isn't it? And then, of course, it's signed Joseph Smith Jr. at the end. So he was the person that wrote this announcement and invoked the will of God in what they're doing here. And, that basically he said, yeah, all of the stuff that we just did, this is the will of God. So, don't question us. Don't question the articles that we set out. Just buy into our company because it's what God wants.
It's the kind of stuff that I've heard in some churches where, they're doing stuff for Jerusalem. They're doing stuff for Zion. They're doing stuff for Jesus. And, when you start evoking that stuff, you're tapping into something that is not reason. You don't want people to critically analyze what you're doing. You want them just to accept that you're doing it for a higher purpose, and you must participate and not question.
Exactly. And that's, so well said. That's what it is. They were invoking the will of God in order to, pull participation out of the members in order to get them to invest. I mean, not only were they saying, like, if you don't invest, you're going to be broke. They were saying if you don't invest, you are going to be, eternally broken, right? This is the will of God. And if you don't do it, it's contrary to the will of God.
Yep. So you're going to make a seed offering.
Yeah. And that just perfectly encapsulates this whole discussion of, like, this intermingling of an ecclesiastical authority mixed with the board of directors of a big company that was only, formed to solve a huge debt crisis that the church had.
And of course, after I'm gone and after my segment here, you can tell all your listeners what happened to this joint stock company. I'm sure they're going to want to know.
Oh, unfortunately, they have to wait a couple of episodes. We have to get into 1838 before it really comes crashing and burning down. But I do have to point out a little point of irony here because they, Oliver Cowdery came back when they established this. He came back with $200,000 worth of notes printed, and the treasurer and the secretary, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon, signed these notes in order to, create them as basically legal tender from this company. And the irony of it is they were completely valueless. They were not even worth the paper they were printed on after it was printed on the paper back then. But nowadays, you can buy one of these, like a $5 bill for like anywhere from $2,000 to $15,000 on eBay or on like collecting sites that have the signatures of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. I mean, they're collectible now. So back then they weren't worth anything, and now they're some of the most valuable historical currency in all of existence.
That's way better than Confederate money has done.
Has it crashed or something?
Confederate money is, it's a dime a dozen. You can go on any site and get Confederate currency. Well, the big difference is that there were only so many of these notes printed and they're hand signed.
So hand signed. Yep.
And there's a limited quantity. Confederate notes at the end of the Civil War, when the Confederate currency became valueless, they printed more and more and more and more of it. So there's millions and millions and millions, tens of millions of Confederate Confederate currency notes. Just like I found out a relative had Adolf Hitler stamps. And I thought, oh my God, these got to be valuable. They printed so many of them. They're everywhere. I mean, almost any stamp collector has or can get a sheet of original Adolf Hitler stamps that you would put on an envelope, and it's worth 50 cents because I can get them anywhere. Wow. So it's all about,
fair enough.
Like investing, it's all about supply and demand.
Supply and demand. There you go. And if you have a really, really, amazing specimen of one of these notes that has the signatures of Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith on it, and it's in really good shape and in mint condition or something, you can fetch about $15,000 with that. So
absolutely,
it's just beautifully ironic. I love it. So Phil, this has been an absolute pleasure, and I just want to thank you so much for coming on and parsing out some of this language, helping me understand it, and hopefully helping the listeners understand it and jazz this up a little bit, because it's kind of boring reading legal documents like this. So Phil, if people want to find you, if they want to hear more of that silky smooth voice and learn more about financial investing, where can they find you?
The show is available virtually anywhere good podcasts can be found. It's The Phil Ferguson Show. I'm so fucking clever. I couldn't even come up with that name, but it's The Phil Ferguson Show. And it's 1/3 finance, 2/3 straight up hardcore evangelical atheism. It's shaken, not stirred. And it's great fun. And there are people that listen to it just for the finance. There's people that listen to it for just the atheism. I don't give a shit if you even listen to it, but please download it. So go to your favorite podcast player, sign up, subscribe to The Phil Ferguson Show, and download every single episode. It somehow makes my empty life feel better.
Touche. Very well said. And of course, I was on for an episode of it, and we talked about Mormon Money, talking about their current financial situation, and that was an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed talking that through with you. So, I don't know if you know the episode number off of the top of your head, but I'm sure that people can. All right.
There went the silky voice. Yeah.
There, yeah, you're right. The cracking, silky voice. But people can find that in your backlog. That'll just force people to go look for it there.
That's right.
If you want to hear about Mormon Money. And of course, lots of skeptical financing. There's lots of good advice there. So once again, thank you, Phil, so much for coming onto the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for letting me play along.
Absolutely. We'll talk to you next time.
Ciao.
And that was the portion with Phil on. Once again, Phil, thank you so much for coming on and helping me parse out some of the confusing language that was in there, and pointing out some details that I otherwise never would have been able to figure out by myself, because you're much more familiar with this information than I am. So Phil, thanks again. But just also real quick, anybody that is a subscriber on patreon.com, be sure to listen to the Patreon only edition, because there was a small snippet that I took out of our discussion here, just for conciseness, but we kind of dive into a discussion about politics and Trump. It was a really fun part of the conversation, but, unfortunately that's just for Patreon, donors only. So if you want to listen to that, be sure to be signed up at patreon.com/nakedmormonism and check out the episode there for the Patreon only edition of this episode. But let's dive back in here and talk about everything that Phil and I discussed with the Articles of Agreement here, and just everything as a whole, right? Everything that we read there, that was the preamble in the Articles of Agreement that were, establishing Joe and Rigdon's biggest racket up to this point, right? The last thing that we read, I think, sums everything up in such a perfect way. This was a company that Joe and Rigdon were starting in order to solve their financial problems. And in the announcement of the company's establishment, we have verses from Isaiah and invocation of God's will. In this one single announcement published in the Messenger and Advocate, everything comes together, expressing the crux of church and financial binding that was this company. The church wasn't financially solvent by any stretch of imagination. So Joe and Rigdon formed this false company to try and solve those financial problems. And then they went on to use scriptural justification for founding it and calling its members to invest in it, calling it the will of God. This one announcement perfectly encapsulates the intermingling of church and business and seems as almost a harbinger for what the church would be from this point on. So to get back to the overall topic at hand, I want to read another extract from the autobiography of Ebenezer Robinson. He was just such a prominent member in the church during all of this, and he remained faithful in all of his dealings and a faithful member of the church. Personally, this is the picture of Ebenezer Robinson that I've constructed. I see him as a very simple and honest man that got caught up in a crazy cult unwittingly. I think he really tells it like it is from a first-person perspective that's lost when we try and examine this whole situation through our own eyes. Quoting from Ebenezer Robinson's autobiography, quote, Joseph Smith Jr. was elected treasurer and Sidney Rigdon was elected secretary. In accordance with the foregoing arrangements, quite a large number of the bills were brought into the printing office, and the word anti in very fine type was printed before the word bank, and the syllable ing, also in fine print, was printed after the word bank, thus making it read Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company, in which form the bills were signed by Joseph Smith Jr., treasurer, and Sidney Rigdon, secretary, and put into circulation as bank bills. We wish our readers to bear in mind that these things have nothing to do with the gospel, but they seem to show us the weakness of poor human nature and how easily men can be led astray when they cease to listen to the counsel of God, but are left to follow the dictates of their own will and carnal desires. The fruit of such conduct is exceedingly bitter, and the results most disastrous, as we will see further on. End quote. This perfectly sums everything up that is the Kirtland Banking Company. Even though Joe used gospel principles and invocation of God's will to justify the establishment of the bank and call its members to join and, give Joe and Rigdon their money, it has nothing to do with the gospel. It just shows us the weakness of poor human nature, as Ebenezer Robinson said. Now, of course, I disagree with Robinson for the sheer fact that I think all of it, the church, everything was a failing of human greed in general. And, Joe and Rigdon were perfect examples of those failings, with everything from the establishment of the banking company all the way back to the foundation of the religion in 1830. Everything they did was out of greed for fame and fortune. Simple as that. Now, there's something even more insidious to add into the mix. And I teased it before our, the little discussion we had with Phil here. This is the thing that was established at about the same time as the Kirtland Banking Company. And the only way to describe this is it was the precursor to the Danites. Now, there's almost no documentation out there that, covers this and discusses it. And the only reference that I can find to this is from the book of John Goebbels Whitmer. Now remember, he was the church historian when he recorded this, and it's recorded in his own handwriting in his own book. And that is available. You can see it in a photocopy of it in his own handwriting on josephsmithpapers.org. There will be a link to the book of John Whitmer in the show notes on archive.org. And if you want to read the passage I'm reading, you can find it on the page by searching for the brother of Gideon, and it'll just point you into the right spot. This is taken from the book of John Whitmer. Quote, "After Smith's return to Kirtland, Ohio, and after his ordering the first elders of the church to go to Ohio, there to receive their endowments from on high, he hastened the finishing of the house of Kirtland, which was commenced before he had gone to Zion to redeem her. He, from this time, began to be lifted up in the pride of his eyes, and began to seek riches and the glory of the world, also sought to establish the ancient order of things, as he and his counselors, Rigdon and Hiram Smith, pleased to call it. Therefore, they began to form themselves into a secret society, which they termed the Brother of Gideon Society, in which society they took oaths that they would support a brother, right or wrong, even to the shedding of blood. Thus, those who belonged to this society were bound to keep it a profound secret, never to reveal, but ever to conceal these abominations from all and every person except those who were of the same craft. But these things could not be kept a secret, in consequence of betrayers who fell from their faith and revealed their secrets." End quote. I had never heard about this Brother of Gideon Society until I stumbled on it in my research for this episode. Just now I found out about this. Nobody talks about this, and it's nearly erased from every other Mormon history book. The Brother of Gideon Society was basically the archetype and foundation for the Daughters of Zion Society, which would later be called the Danites, who were essentially the roaming gang of Mormons that constituted an enforcer squad. Now, Orrin Pistol Packin' Porter Rockwell, as we know him, would be the leader of the Danites when it formed a year and a half after the Brothers of Gideon here, which was formed in the late 1836. But the principle holds for the need of an enforcer squad, and this is when Joe and Rigdon finally got around to building that infrastructure. When somebody wasn't paying up to the bank, or when they left the church or under unpleasant circumstances, they could expect a visit from the Danites, who were bound together with a blood oath, who would defend the prophet of the church until death, who, more importantly, would never question an order that was passed down from the highest ranks of leadership. Joe's Mormon church finally became a crime syndicate with a street gang of thugs to enforce their will. Now, I have to be honest. When I started the research for this episode, I didn't think we would see a transition like this. But something happened in this episode. I'm not sure exactly how to describe it, but I think a fundamental shift took place. Now, I seem to say this on most episodes, but I love Joseph Smith, right? I mean, he's an intensely fascinating historical individual, and the best part of my job is finding out what crazy shit he's going to get into in the next episode of the show. But I feel like something fundamentally shifted in this episode. Of course, this probably only really happened in my mind, considering my own individual perspective of Joe, but I feel like he became a little more serious and malevolent at the end of 1836. Now, I've always seen him as like a no fucks given party boy that just, gets into his own brand of mischief in some way every other week. But this time, the Joe in my mind, the picture of Joseph that I've constructed in my mind, has changed. What's that old saying, right? Desperate times call for desperate measures. I mean, can we apply that to Joe in 1836 here at the end? Beginning 1837? Maybe something along the lines of, like desperate circumstances incite drastic changes. Joe isn't the goofy party boy, getting caught with one hand in Fanny Alger's pants anymore. He just turned into a mob boss. He isn't traveling halfway across the civilized country to hunt for treasure anymore. He's forming secret alliances with blood oaths. He isn't getting into scrapes with people that offend him anymore. He's ordering Pistol Pack and Porter to pay them a visit and do his bidding. Joe isn't buying stupid papyri and mummies and telling everybody he knows what's on them. He's printing counterfeit money and constructing a false economy based on that money. Joe isn't staring into a seer stone and coming up with revelation. He's staring at legal documents to figure out the best way to legally fuck over his followers and get rich by doing so, as we can see with the help of Phil Ferguson today. Personally, I've wondered for some time when this change would happen. I mean, if we look at the Church of Christ of 1831 that Joe founded, and try and compare it to the LDS Church today, one's a lamb and the latter is a lion, right? I've wondered for a long time if there was a single point in Mormon history that we could reference where this shift happened. When the church stopped being a church within a community and started becoming a cutthroat, tax-exempt business. And I think we just witnessed that transition. Honestly, I'm a bit surprised. I thought that this transition would happen after the Carthage shootout, when bloody fucking Brigham took over for himself, because we can see just how ruthlessly he ran the church in Utah. And there's no denying that today's LDS church evolved from the foundation of Brigham's rule. The point is, I didn't think we would see this transition during the Joseph Smith years. I still picture him being an idiot party boy, running around Nauvoo with a white horse and, with a general's uniform on, holding a sword, calling himself the King of Zion and fucking every woman that can successfully convert oxygen into carbon dioxide. But that, that's just a silly caricature of Joe, right? But maybe that's a failing in my own perspective. Maybe I've been looking at the Nauvoo Joe the wrong way. Maybe the Nauvoo Joe was more similar to the Utah Bloody Brigham than he was to the Palmyra Joe party boy that we've known to this point. We're seeing the evolution of Joe's personality due to the circumstances. The Joe that emerged from 1836 is a darker and much more threatening Joe than we've ever seen before, ready to fuck anybody before they even get a chance to fuck him. I suppose I'm most fascinated by the fact that we can see the earliest signs of the current Mormon church start to be played out this early on in Joe's timeline. Whether it was with the doctrine, with the publication that Sidney Rigdon released, talking about God being a body of flesh and bone, or talking about the establishment of the church, or talking about the establishment of the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company to try and fuck over the followers of the church. But as 1837 and 1838 roll around, Joe seems to become less concerned with the doctrine and teachings of the church and much more interested in how successful the church is and what his owned stocks are trading for. Gone are the days of the silly and mischievous Joe that we know, and fast approaching are the days of Don Joseph Smith and Consigliere Sidney Rigdon. Now, what can we learn from this development and evolution of early Mormon church structure? I would say that it looks much more similar to the church we see today. Of course, today's church is somewhat focused on their religious teachings, right? But that only occupies a very small percentage of the day-to-day lives of the leadership. Now, of course, this is my own speculation and just my own perspective. That's not worth much, so take it with a grain of salt and maybe, a big rip from the bong. But the vast majority of the time the quorum of the 12 apostles spends relates to the business portion of the church. It's called the Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, not the LDS Church. Today, the leadership have speechwriters to take care of the biannual general conference talks that they give. They have writers that publish the messages in the Ensign and other church periodicals. They have committees of people that take care of all of the content on the website. They have computer programs that designate where missionaries will be called to based on previous growth and other algorithms that take dozens of other parameters into account. They have statisticians that plot where the next groundbreaking for the newest temple will be. The only thing these men focus on from day to day is the business aspect of the church. Is it any wonder why they haven't significantly progressed in their doctrine since Joe died and Rigdon splintered off? The only significant change in over 170 years has been giving blacks a priesthood, and that only came at a time when the church's tax-exempt status was threatened, as well as their BYU sports team. But it's been nothing but a business for over a century and a half now. And we can see the beginning of this conversion from doctrine centrism to business centrism happening over the last few years in the church timeline. Now, let me just take a second here to draw a parallel to this podcast, because I can't help but see some similarities, and, I want to call them out and address them directly. You may be wondering, like, what the hell are you talking about? But just, indulge me for a minute here. Money is a real thing, right? And it's something that everybody has to deal with. Joe's church was in financial ruin. So he made a solution by founding a company whose export was counterfeit money to solve the problem. It backfired and resulted in the largest exodus of members and leaders of the church in all of church history, because so many people got burned and lost everything they had. Joe was an underhanded miscreant, and Rigdon was his degenerate imposter right-hand corruption insider second in command. They did all their business dealings under the guise of being a church. Phil and I talked about this, but they were manufacturing an invisible product that put a monopoly on people's afterlife and told those people that God commanded them to buy that product. The church today does the same goddamn thing. They manufacture an invisible product with no actual manufacturing costs, then scare you into buying that product, and then lock you in by saying you'll lose everything if you don't buy our product, because God will no longer love you, or your family will no longer love you, whatever the case may be. They don't use that terminology, but a sentence to hell or outer darkness or apostasy is the equivalent of God and the church and the community not loving you anymore. This is obscene, unethical, corrupt, depraved, and downright fucking wrong. They're a business and only looking out for the best interests of that business. Whether it was Joe's church in 1836 or the Salt Lake City LDS church, they are a shadowed facade, masking their own self-interest by claiming divine mandate. And it works. I can't help but be disgusted by the hypocrisy, and I hope I'm not the only one that feels this way. Now, let me draw the parallels and the differences between the church and what I'm doing with this podcast, because let's just face it, I'm selling a product that is nothing more than just invisible information on the face of it, right? I mean, when the show started, it was nothing but a hobby that I did for fun to get the information out there. But since the beginning, it's shifted. It's transitioned into a business that essentially produces an invisible product. Now, I mean, you see the podcast come up every week in your feed, so I suppose it's not invisible in that sense. It also requires an insane amount of time and a small amount of overhead and infrastructure to actually produce, so it's not invisible in that sense either. But this podcast isn't a blender that sits on your counter, right? I mean, the best thing gleaned from this show is the information, right? And hopefully some level of community to belong to, but you can't hold a podcast in your hand, nor can you cook your food with a podcast. It's essentially an invisible product. Now, I have to say this, the Nemos are truly the best listeners of any podcast out there. And trust me, this isn't flattery. I mean, I run 2.5 podcasts, so I'm basing that claim on plenty of my own empirical evidence. The listeners of this show are amazing, and the sense of community that I get from all of you is something I'm indescribably thankful for. And hopefully that same sense of community is reflected through your headphones every week when the show pops up in your podcast app. In a sense, I suppose, this show is an invisible product because you can't blend food with a podcast. You can't take your kids to school in a podcast, nor can you eat or drink it. But in the abstract, hopefully you, the listener, take away the information presented and use it in some way that's tangible to you, making this product still invisible, but in a different sense, very real. That, however, is where the similarities between the church and the podcast end. We both make invisible products, but after that, no similarities exist. Now, I don't claim to be the one true podcast. And if you listen to any other podcast and you're no longer welcome to listen to this, I mean, that's what the church claims. I don't. I mean, I guess a few episodes back, I did say that this is the one true Mormon history podcast, but I only said that to lampoon the church's claim on holding the singular truth on, their God claims, right? However, I'm happy to invite people like Phil onto the show to bring in some expertise that I don't know. And I even said, go check out his show. There's going to be links to find him in the show notes because he produces a great podcast. There are hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there, the vast majority of them being better than this one. And I encourage everybody to get out there and listen to new shows all the time. That's why I love bringing on podcasters and having them plug their shows. I even encourage everybody possible to make their own podcast because there's no such thing as too many voices out there in the podcasting world. The point is, you won't go to hell or feel God's wrath for not listening to this show. You just won't know the information that's contained in each and every, 4-hour long episode. 4 hours, of course, being an average anyway. Also, I don't masquerade as a church with a divinity claim and ask for donations. I very plainly say at the end of every episode, if you want to support the production of the show, go to patreon.com/nakedmormonism to sign up to make a per episode donation. And then every 2 weeks, I thank everybody that signs up to essentially buy the show through Patreon instead of just listening to it for free. The point is, it's hard to sell a product that's available for free everywhere on the internet. Now let me just, kind of toss in some hard numbers here to offer a little bit of perspective. Before I started doing this full time, I was driving a truck making somewhere around $20 an hour. That allowed for all kinds of luxuries and a nice car, being a single dude with no kids. But the reality is I was working 55 hours a week while putting in an obscene number of hours into this podcast to build it to a sustainable level. Now I'm able to devote those 55 hours a week to this show, which has allowed it to go to a weekly basis instead of bi-weekly, and made it so I can start and maintain the Glassbox podcast while writing a book and working on multiple other projects and appearing on a weekly other show on my Book of Mormon podcast. And, there's other stuff in the works as well. The details will be coming out in the next few weeks here. But I do have to say, there's recently been a small outflux of support on Patreon that hasn't matched the incoming new patrons like it usually does. Really, if you calculate everything out, I'm working for about $3.49 an hour right now, which is about 1/5 of the minimum wage in Seattle where I'm living. Now that wage was somewhat sustainable in the 1970s or, when I was living in Greeley, Colorado, a super cheap town that's basically run by drug lords north of Denver. But in Seattle, it's a different story. And the reality is, if not for my amazing girlfriend, I simply wouldn't be able to continue doing this. But on the bright side, small silver lining, if it continues at this level, I won't have to pay any taxes for 2016. So that's kind of nice. But that being said, I have to make an honest petition for more supporters on Patreon. I mean, even NPR, the huge bastion of, honest reporting and unbiased thinking, and does a pledge drive a couple of times a year to continue running in the black, petitioning for more support so that they don't have actual commercials. And unfortunately, this is a necessary evil given the nature of spoken audio entertainment. Now, I really don't want to go to like corporate sponsor for various reasons, and I'd like to keep the show running commercial free with the exception of taking a few minutes every 2 weeks to thank new supporters on Patreon. So right now, about 2% of the audience supports the show, which is actually a bit above average for the typical podcast that is signed up through Patreon. Once again, that's because the listeners of this show are amazing and they're really the best audience a podcaster could have. But if we could bump that number to 3 or 4%, things would be, I'll just say it, much more comfortable. And I could roll that extra money into further investment and expansion of the show and the many other projects that I'm working on right now. Now, in the past, I've only charged for 2 episodes per month, but this needs to change as well. So, the show is weekly and I need to charge for a weekly basis. So if you're a current supporter and you need to change your pledge level to reflect this adjustment, I completely understand, and that's just absolutely fine. So, please feel free to do that because the show is going to be charged for every episode release as opposed to just 2 monthly as it was in the past. But I'm also willing to create an extra incentive here. The one primary criticism I receive about the show is the explicit nature of it. I've made my case countless times by this point that, I like to rant, and when certain expressive words are off fucking limits, I don't feel quite as natural and comfortable, and I don't feel like I can add the extra gravity to the rant that I want to. Also, I like my guests to be able to speak their mind without having to censor themselves, like Phil did in this episode. He does a great job. That being said, once the show reaches the $500 per episode level, every week I'm going to release one of the historical episodes from the backlog with bleeps instead of fucks and shits. This is really the best of both worlds. I can still rant and get angry, but those with sensitive ears can still listen in and not be offended. You can also recommend these, clean versions of the episodes to true believing Mormons, and they'll only be able to be offended at the content instead of at all of the fucks and shits that are included in, dispersed throughout the content. We're barely more than $100 per episode away from this, cleanup goal, and I hope this provides some kind of incentive for people to sign up to buy the show for $1 or $2 an episode on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Now, to you, it may only be a Starbucks per month or, a gallon of gas per month. But for me, it's a livelihood. And that's kind of the difference here. All of this to say, I hope nobody's offended that I'm asking openly for money and for support because this is a podcast, right? It's the grassroots media of the millennial era, and podcasts are supposed to be open and free. So to anybody that might be offended or want to make that point, I'll just say the show is free. It's still free for everybody, and currently over 97% of the listeners don't pay a penny for it. So that's still grassroots in my mind, and I'm not locking entire episodes behind paywalls like some other more mainstream podcasts. I just release Patreon-only episodes that have small additions to the regular episodes like, Phil's and my discussion about Trump and the politics. The rest of the show is still completely free, and it will remain that way for the foreseeable future. Now, to draw a bit of a distinction between what the church does and what I do. There's parallels, but there's also some massive differences. We both offer information and hopefully a sense of community. However, they put their information behind a paywall. Mine is free, and you can pay if you feel generous enough to do so. They have a bigger community than the ex-Mormon community, but that won't be true forever. They claim to have divine truth, and that if you go to any other church, you'll be lost to a lower level of eternity. I encourage you to listen to as many podcasts as you possibly can, and hopefully you continue to listen to this one. They consider somebody starting their own religion to be blasphemy. I consider somebody starting their own podcast to be one more voice that we need in the fight against religion. They say only to listen to information that they put out. I tell you where I find my information and encourage you to read more by providing links in the show notes and telling you exactly where I'm reading things from. You can only be part of the church's exclusive club if you give them 10% of your income, but I politely ask and thank you for less than 0.00137% of your income without requiring it. They put up a granite white facade as a non-profit religious organization to mask their billions of dollars in tax-free worldwide income. I come right out and say that this podcast is a business in need of financial support without the bullshit facade. They have billions of dollars, millions of members, and a missionary force of nearly 90,000 people. We could never reach those numbers. They have hundreds of videos of people bearing their testimony online, and we have 85 5-star reviews on iTunes. Hopefully all of that illustrates the differences between the money centrism of the church that claims to be the one lifeline to reaching God in the afterlife, and the information centrism of this podcast that comes right out and says it is in need of sustainable income to survive. Given those differences, though, what is it? What is that one line that's, Joe's favorite line that Mormons use all the time to describe how, this one country bumpkin, uneducated man could, bring about the Book of Mormon and confound all of the mighty religions? Yeah, that's it. It's from the very first section of the Book of Covenants. The weak things of the world shall come forth and break down the mighty and strong ones. Ironic, given what was said in the previous paragraph. Let's just see how long that takes. And that is it for the historical portion of today's episode. As per usual, I will do a Patreon appreciation next week, but I do have a couple of announcements to talk about. If you are wanting to catch up on a recent guest spot that I was on, check out the Wayward Atheist podcast. There's going to be a link for it in the show notes. Also, I wanted to let everybody know I'm going to be in Salt Lake from July 27th to August 1st for the Sunstone Symposium. Basically, if you aren't aware of what the Sunstone Symposium is, it's this huge gathering of Mormonism, basically. Initially, it was created in the 1970s as a magazine that tried to tackle some of the challenging problems in Mormon history and whatnot. And slowly it's grown to be a very awesome community of people that discuss Mormonism. And the people that will be attending are going to be a mix, probably about 50-50 mix of believing Mormons and non-believers or ex-Mormons. So I'm really excited to be there. I'm actually volunteering at one of the desks to get, discounted tickets for entry. So that's super exciting. I'm going to be able to see a lot of people, meet them, and I'm going to have on a Naked Mormonism t-shirt. I'm excited. So, the Sunstone Symposium, check the show notes for a link to that because very soon I'm going to be there and I hope I can maybe possibly see some of you there. It's going to be awesome. There's a lot of talks lined up, a lot of seminars where they discuss certain points of Mormonism or Mormon doctrine or, confusing parts in Mormon history. There's going to be a lot of Mormon historians attending, Grant Palmer, Sandra Tanner from Utah Lighthouse Ministries, D. Michael Quinn from, early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. And there's going to be a lot of Mormon historians there that I'm hoping that I get to meet and speak with for a little while, discuss with them the merits of some of the claims that I've made and see what they think about that, because the chances are they probably don't espouse some of the weirder perspectives that I've taken on some of the topics that we've discussed. But all that to be said, the Sunstone Symposium is coming up very soon. If you're able to go to any one of the days of the 3-day long symposium, I really recommend it. There's, check the actual website of Sunstone Symposium that's in the show notes for their program list and when they have things scheduled to, pick which day you want to go. There's pretty much anything that somebody of the Mormon or ex-Mormon community wants. There's going to be something there for them to enjoy. So that's just, a couple of quick announcements. And also one thing that I wanted to add in, it's a feature of the show that I've been, toying around with if I wanted to add in or not recently. And I just decided to do it. And I actually got one of my friends to, be the first person to do this. So I wanted to thank him. He doesn't say his name in the voicemail. So, I'll just say thank you. You know who you are, but I set up a voicemail line for the show. And every historical episode after the bumper from the historical portion into the announcements section that we're in right now. Before talking about the announcements, I'm going to be playing voicemails from anybody that happens to send in the voicemail. So thank you very much to the person that sent this in. He's one of my I consider him one of my good friends now. And, if you want to call in and leave your own voicemail, you can do so by calling 864-625-3366 or 864-NAKED-MO. Yeah, that's right. 864-NAKED-MO, 864-625-3366. No parameters whatsoever, no limits on what you want to say. Just if you want to call in, leave your voicemail, you can use your name or not, and just say, what's on your mind, talk about something that was talked about in previous episodes, talk about your story a little bit. Please call in, and I'd be more than happy to save up a bank of those and play one every historical episode. So thank you so much to the guy that sent in this episode's voicemail. I did ask him to do it, and he sent in a fantastic voicemail. Thank you so much. And once again, thank you to Phil for being a guest on this episode. I really had a good time talking with him. Be sure to check out the Patreon-only edition of this episode, where you get to hear the entire discussion unedited between Phil and I, and where we talk about Trump and other politics. But before shutting it down and calling it a night, there's a few people I need to thank. Of course, as always, need to thank Demonista for running the Facebook page. She does a fantastic job there. If you want to know way more about Mormonism and little bonus tidbits here and there of Mormonism and history, check out the Facebook page, and thank you so much to her for running that. Also need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music in this show that's used with his permission. If you want to listen to more of his music, go to aloststateofmind.com. Also need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork for this show, as well as for the daughter podcast, the Glassbox Podcast. If you want to check out his forum, go to weirdmormonshit.com. Also check out the daughter show, the Glassbox Podcast, where we read possible source texts for the Book of Mormon. If you want to leave a voicemail for the show, check out 864-625-3366 or 864-NAKED-MO. Leave your voicemail on that line, and it will be played in an upcoming historical episode. Thank you so much to all of the patrons that support the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, and thank you most of all to all of you lovely listeners for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.
Hey, Bryce. I hope this reaches you, but I just wanted to say I absolutely love what you're doing with the show. I'm super excited about it. I started listening to it. I was really, just to kind of give you the history, I was pretty lost with what to do with like me and my wife and everything, because she's still a true believing Mormon. But the weird thing is, seeing how ridiculous the whole story is and what the true story is actually made me not so judgmental of her, because it's all just, I can understand how she's so lost with it. So anyway, Bryce, I want you to know that I appreciate what you do. I feel like you've added a lot to my relationship with how I look at my wife and how I treat her, and just kind of going through and those rants or email segments at the end of your show. I absolutely love those. So just wanted to give you a thumbs up over the phone, let you know I appreciate what you do, and hopefully you're around for a long time. Thanks.
Meow.